Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It was an ordinary day, or at least it seemed that way when I first stepped outside. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the cracked sidewalk as I walked towards the corner store. The hum of distant traffic was a familiar backdrop, but something was different today. Something I couldn't yet place tugged at my senses. I had just passed the old oak tree when I saw it, lying in the gutter like a forgotten relic from another time. A mobile phone. The screen was cracked, the edges scraped as if it had seen better days. But there was something strange about it. It seemed out of place. No one in my neighborhood ever seemed to drop their phones. People were more protective of their devices, clutching them in their hands like lifelines. I bent down and picked it up. The phone was cold, almost unnervingly so. It felt like it had been there much longer than it had. No fingerprints, no signs of recent use. Just the quiet weight of it in my palm. At first, I considered just leaving it there. But curiosity got the better of me. I pressed the power button, half expecting it to be completely dead. But to my surprise, the screen flickered on. A blank lock screen greeted me. I tried to swipe it open, but it wouldn't respond. Frustrated, I pressed a few more buttons, hoping for some clue as to what this phone was doing out here in the street. Suddenly, the screen went dark, and I heard it, the faintest ring of an incoming call. I froze, my thumb hovering over the screen. Who would be calling? The phone wasn't even connected to a network. There was no way this was normal. But the phone kept ringing, its tone faint but persistent, until I reluctantly accepted the call. "Hello?" I said, my voice trembling more than I intended. It was as if the phone had somehow tricked me into answering, its dark screen now showing nothing but static. A moment passed, then a voice crackled through the receiver. "Help, please." The voice was weak, urgent, and filled with an unmistakable desperation. But those words, sent a shiver down my spine. There was something strange about them, something off. It was as if the voice was pleading for help, but it couldn't explain from what. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask what was going on, but my throat felt tight. The voice continued, its whispers almost impossible to make out, distorting with each passing second. "Help me, they're coming." The line went dead. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at the blank screen in disbelief. A cold sweat beaded on my forehead as the weight of the phone seemed to double in my hand. I had to force myself to take a deep breath, shaking off the panic that threatened to overwhelm me. What was that? Who was that? And what did they mean, "they're coming"? I wanted to throw the phone down, to drop it and run. But something stopped me. A small voice in the back of my head told me that I had to know more. What if someone was in danger? What if I could help? I glanced around. No one was nearby, and the street was eerily quiet, the hum of traffic no longer as comforting as it had been moments ago. The air felt heavier now, colder. It was as if the world had shifted, subtly, imperceptibly, but enough to make me feel like I wasn't alone. My fingers tightened around the phone as I stood there, unsure of what to do next. And then, just as I was about to put the phone down, it buzzed again. A text message. It was a single line of text, simple and to the point. Don't trust it. I stared at the words, my heart pounding in my chest. The phone had only been on for a few minutes, and yet it already felt like it had been a part of my life for much longer. The warnings, the voice, the eerie feeling that had settled over me, it was all too much. But I couldn't stop myself from reading the message again, as if doing so might somehow provide some clarity. But the more I looked at it, the less sense it made. Who had sent this? What did it mean? I looked around once more, feeling the unease in my gut grow. The street was still empty, but the world felt different. The shadows under the trees seemed darker, the wind colder. It was like the phone had disturbed something that shouldn't have been disturbed. And I had no idea what I was about to unleash. The text message lingered on the screen, glowing faintly in the dimming light. Don't trust it. The words seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stepped into something much larger than I could comprehend, and the weight of that knowledge pressed down on me like a physical force. I stared at the phone for a long time, unsure of what to do next. Part of me wanted to leave it where it was, to walk away and pretend I'd never seen it. But another part, the part that couldn't ignore the strange urgency in the voice on the other end, kept me rooted to the spot. Who had sent the message? Who had made that call? And what did they mean by don't trust it? Was the phone somehow a trap, or was I supposed to be wary of the message itself? A rustling sound behind me broke my train of thought, and I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat. There was nothing. Just the same empty street, the wind pushing leaves along the sidewalk. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, as though something was lingering just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. I took a hesitant step forward, the phone still clutched tightly in my hand. It felt wrong. Every instinct screamed at me to get rid of it, to walk away, to pretend none of this had happened. But another part of me, the part that couldn't resist a mystery, urged me to keep going. To find out who had called, who had sent that message. To understand what was happening. I turned the phone over in my hands, the weight of it feeling heavier than before. The screen was still cracked, and the static that had flickered across it earlier had returned, faint but unsettling. I pressed the power button again, hoping that maybe, just maybe, there would be something on the screen that could explain all of this. But the screen remained blank. A sudden, sharp noise broke the silence, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from the darkness at the far end of the street. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. It wasn't the sound of a car engine or the rustle of trees. It was something else, something unnatural. I turned in the direction of the noise, my pulse racing. The street ahead was empty, but the air felt thicker. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, and the wind, which had been a mild breeze only moments ago, was now biting, cold, and relentless. The phone buzzed again, pulling my attention back to it. Another message. Get inside. I felt my stomach drop. The words were short, urgent, but this time there was something more to them. They weren't a warning, they were a command. Without thinking, I started walking, my feet moving faster than they should have. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, every step I took making me feel more exposed, more vulnerable. My eyes darted from side to side, searching for something, anything, that might explain what was happening. But the street remained quiet, as though nothing had changed at all. I had almost reached my door when the phone buzzed once more, this time vibrating violently in my hand. The screen flickered to life, showing a new message, this one not from the same number as before. It was an image. A dark, blurry shape. I couldn't make out what it was, but the shape was unmistakable, something large, something with a form that didn't quite belong. The edges were jagged, like a shadow that refused to obey the rules of light. And there, in the center of the image, was a face, its eyes wide and empty, staring straight through the screen at me. The message that accompanied it was brief, chilling. Not alone. I nearly dropped the phone, my hands trembling as I backed away from the door. The air around me felt heavier, as though the very space I occupied had become thicker, more oppressive. The shadows under the trees had deepened, and the world around me seemed quieter now, as if even the wind had been silenced. I turned, almost instinctively, my heart hammering in my chest. And that's when I saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the street. It was tall, indistinct, like a shadow that had taken form. But it wasn't the shape that struck me first, it was the sound. The faintest, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps dragging, slowly, across the pavement. A shuffling sound, as if something was moving just out of sync with the world around it. I didn't stop to think. I didn't even look back. I ran. The phone was still clutched in my hand as I sprinted toward my apartment door, my heart racing, the blood pounding in my ears. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with shaking hands. My breath came in short, panic bursts, my mind spinning. But as I stood there, leaning against the door, trying to calm myself, I realized something. The phone had stopped ringing. The house, too, had fallen eerily silent. No footsteps. No wind. No sound at all. And then I heard it. Faint at first, but unmistakable. A knock. It was slow, methodical, deliberate. The knock of someone, or something, that was not supposed to be there. The knock came again, louder this time. A sharp, rhythmic sound that seemed to pierce through the silence of my apartment. My breath caught in my throat, and I pressed my back harder against the door, willing myself to stay still, to not make a sound. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to call for help, to scream out into the night, but I knew it wouldn't matter. No one would come. And if they did, would they be able to help me? Or would they be drawn into whatever had started with that strange phone call? The knock came once more, this time followed by a soft, hollow voice from the other side. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. Let me in. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a plea. It was simply a statement. But it was enough to send a chill straight to my bones. I took a step back, my eyes darting around the room as if expecting something to appear in the corners of my vision. The room was dark, lit only by the dull glow of the streetlights filtering in through the curtains. The phone in my hand was still vibrating, as though urging me to do something, but I couldn't bring myself to answer it again. It had already brought me enough terror. The knocking continued, relentless, echoing in the empty hallway outside. Each tap on the door seemed to grow more insistent, as if whatever was on the other side knew I was there, knew I was listening. Please, let me in. I swallowed hard, the words pressing on me like a weight. I felt as though I was suffocating in the stillness of my own apartment. The air was thick, the silence oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving outside, something unseen but very much present. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, to think clearly. If I stayed quiet, would it go away? If I ignored it, would the knocking stop? Or would it escalate, becoming something worse? Another knock. Louder. Closer. And then, without warning, the phone in my hand buzzed again. I almost dropped it in shock, my fingers fumbling to steady it. I hesitated before pressing the screen, but I couldn't resist. I had to know. The screen flickered to life, and there, once again, was a new message. Don't open the door. My heart skipped a beat. The words sent a wave of icy dread through me. I wasn't sure if I should be relieved or terrified, but one thing was certain: the situation had become far more dangerous than I had realized. But it wasn't the message that made my blood run cold. It was what came after. Another knock, but this time the sound was different. It wasn't on the door. It was on the window. The sharp rapping came from the window to my left, just out of my line of sight. I froze, my eyes widening in horror. Slowly, I turned my head, my pulse quickening. There, outside the window, just beyond the curtain, was a figure. The same shadowy shape from before. It wasn't just standing there now, it was moving, shifting closer, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I could barely make out its features, but I didn't need to. I could feel its presence, an oppressive weight in the air, pressing down on me. My throat tightened, and I fought to breathe. The figure outside didn't move like a person. It was wrong. It didn't make any sense. The way it swayed, how it bent unnaturally, this was not something that belonged in the world I knew. I backed away from the window, my feet stumbling as I tried to put distance between myself and whatever that thing was. The phone in my hand buzzed again, but I didn't look at it this time. I couldn't. I had to get out of here. I grabbed my jacket from the chair, my mind racing. Should I leave through the back door? Should I hide in the closet? I couldn't stay in here. Not with whatever was out there. I had no idea what it was, but I was certain it wasn't human. A sudden crash broke the silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. The figure outside had moved, and it had shattered the window in one swift motion, its hand, no, not a hand, a twisted, clawed appendage reaching through the jagged glass to find its way inside. I didn't wait another second. I bolted toward the back door, flinging it open and stumbling into the alley behind my building. The night air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't care. I ran. The streetlights blurred as I sprinted, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it then, the sound of something following me, moving just out of sight. It wasn't human, I knew that much. The way it moved was wrong. The way it made no sound until it was too late. I couldn't outrun it. It was only a matter of time before it caught up with me. I turned a corner, not knowing where I was going, not caring. The only thing on my mind was escape. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was right behind me. And then, in the middle of the alley, I stopped. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Because I wasn't alone anymore. I stood frozen, my legs trembling beneath me as I fought for breath. The cold night air was thick with the scent of wet concrete and the sound of my own panicked heartbeat. My mind raced, but every thought was clouded by a single, terrifying realization: I wasn't alone. There was something behind me. The alley was dark, save for the faint glow of streetlights casting long, jagged shadows. I slowly turned my head, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained my ears to listen. There was nothing. No footsteps, no shuffling sound, no sign that anything was following me. But I knew it was there. I could feel it, pressing on me from all sides, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. I took a step backward, my eyes darting to the narrow openings between buildings, looking for a way out. I couldn't keep running forever, but I had no choice. I had to find safety, something, anything to protect me from whatever this thing was. And then I heard it. A soft, barely audible scrape, like fingers dragging against the pavement. The sound was so faint, yet it reverberated through the alley as if it was right behind me, breathing down my neck. I whipped around, but the alley was empty. No figure, no shadow, nothing out of place. My pulse was racing, and I could feel the sweat beading on my forehead, my hands slick and cold. I was losing my mind. The fear, the anxiety, it was all becoming too much. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't solid, not fully formed, but it was there, flitting just at the edge of my vision, like something that didn't belong in the natural world. It wasn't a person, not a living creature. It was something darker, something wrong. A blackness that seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light. I turned and ran again, my feet pounding against the hard ground as I sprinted toward the end of the alley. My breath came in ragged gasps, and the air around me felt heavier, colder with each step. I was almost at the exit when I heard it again. The scrape of nails against the pavement, louder this time. The sound was unmistakable, and it was closer than before. My chest tightened in terror. I turned the corner, looking for escape, but my legs gave out from under me. I crashed to the ground, scraping my palms on the cold asphalt as I struggled to push myself back up. And then I heard it. A voice. Soft, but unmistakable. Not so fast. It was a whisper, but it was enough to send a jolt of pure terror through my veins. The voice didn't sound human. It didn't sound anything like a person. It was distorted, warbled, like a broken radio station struggling to pick up a signal. I could feel it inside my head, echoing in the empty space between my ears. I scrambled to my feet, panic rising in my throat, but I couldn't run anymore. I was trapped. The shadow in front of me moved again, shifting and twisting like liquid darkness. It was there, right in front of me now, its shape flickering in and out of focus, too distorted to make sense of. The only thing I could see clearly were its eyes, pale, wide, empty, and staring directly at me. I took a step back, my heart racing, my breath shallow and erratic. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching me with those eyes. The terror I felt was like nothing I had ever known. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something primal, an instinctual understanding that I was no longer in control of my own fate. And then, from behind me, I heard a familiar sound, the faint buzz of a phone vibrating. It was my phone. I fumbled for it in my pocket, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I pulled it out. The screen glowed in the darkness, revealing a new message. Run. I didn't have time to think. I didn't have time to process what was happening. My body moved on its own, driven by pure instinct, and I ran, again, faster than before, not looking back. The thing in the alley didn't follow. But it didn't need to. I could still feel it, lurking just beyond the edges of my awareness, watching me from the darkness. The phone in my hand buzzed again, but I ignored it. I couldn't answer. I couldn't think. All I could do was run. But no matter how far I ran, no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't escape it. I could feel the presence of the thing, close, too close. I wasn't alone. The ground beneath me suddenly gave way, and I stumbled into the street. A car screeched to a halt, and the driver honked, his face a blur as I scrambled to my feet. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I ran and ran, down streets, through alleyways, across intersections, all the while feeling it there, close, ever present. The buzzing of my phone cut through the chaos, and I glanced at it for a fleeting moment. Another message. Look behind you. I didn't dare. I couldn't. But I felt it. I felt its presence behind me, like an invisible weight pressing down on me from all sides. I couldn't keep running forever. My strength was fading. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. My legs burned, and my vision blurred as the city around me turned into an indistinct blur. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know how to stop it. All I knew was that it was getting closer. The city was a blur around me, the streetlights streaking past like fading stars, the rush of wind in my ears drowned out by the pounding of my heartbeat. My legs felt like lead, and my chest burned with each ragged breath. I couldn't stop running. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to keep moving, to keep going, to outrun whatever it was that was following me. But I knew deep down that running was pointless. It would catch me. It would always catch me. The shadow, the presence that was always just behind me, waiting, watching, never needing to move faster than I could. It had all the time in the world. The phone in my hand buzzed again, its screen flashing with another message. Stop. I didn't. I couldn't. I had no idea what would happen if I stopped, and I wasn't willing to find out. I kept running, weaving through the streets, my mind desperate for a way out, for some escape, some salvation. But the more I ran, the closer the feeling became. It was like the air itself was thickening around me, closing in, suffocating me. Then, suddenly, I skidded to a stop. I didn't do it consciously, didn't decide to. It was as if my legs simply gave out from underneath me, my body refusing to go any further. I stumbled forward, and the phone slipped from my hand, hitting the pavement with a soft crack. My breathing was shallow, my pulse hammering in my ears, but I couldn't take another step. Something had changed. The city, the world around me, had shifted. I looked around, my eyes wide with terror, and realized, with a sudden, horrifying clarity, that I didn't recognize where I was. The streets I had just run down were gone. The familiar buildings, the landmarks I had passed only moments ago, they were nowhere to be seen. The city, the world, had changed. I was no longer in my neighborhood. I was no longer in my reality. The sound of the wind stopped. The hum of the distant traffic, the city noises that had always been there, had all disappeared. It was like the world itself had gone quiet. And then I heard it. The scraping sound, closer than ever before. It wasn't just on the ground now. It was coming from above. From the sky. It was the sound of something dragging, something huge and heavy, and it was moving toward me. I turned around slowly, my body rigid with fear. The shadow was there again, no longer just a flicker at the edge of my vision. It was right in front of me, standing tall and dark, like a wall of nothingness that consumed the light around it. But this time, it wasn't just the shape that terrified me. It was what I saw within it. There were eyes. Hundreds, thousands of eyes, scattered across the black void of the shadow. Eyes that blinked in and out of existence, each one staring at me, unblinking, unseeing, but full of malice. Their gaze was suffocating, overwhelming, as though they were peeling away layers of my very being. I backed away, my legs shaking, but the shadow followed, slowly, deliberately. The scraping sound grew louder, more intense. Something was coming for me, something that had always been there, just waiting for me to step into its domain. I reached down to grab the phone, my hands trembling, and picked it up. The screen was cracked, the display distorted and broken, but there was one last message. Time to choose. The words burned into my brain as though they were carved into my very soul. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what this meant. What choice did I have? What was I supposed to choose? The shadow was getting closer, and I knew that I didn't have much time left. Whatever this thing was, it was coming for me. And I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't escape it. I could feel the weight of the choice pressing on me. But what was the choice? What was it that I needed to decide? In a flash, it hit me. It wasn't a choice between running or staying, or even between life and death. It was a choice of surrender. Surrendering to whatever this thing was, to the darkness that had been stalking me since I first found that phone. A scream rose in my throat, but I swallowed it down, trying to keep my composure. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what choice would save me, if any of them would. The scraping sound was deafening now. It wasn't just one thing. It was 1,000 things moving together. I could feel the ground beneath me tremble, like something huge was approaching, like something massive was about to crash into me. I closed my eyes, heart racing, and made my choice. I dropped the phone. The shadows surged forward, enveloping me in a suffocating, cold darkness. The air around me became thick, impossible to breathe. I could feel the presence, the eyes, pressing in, surrounding me, but I didn't fight. I didn't scream. I had made my choice. There was no turning back now. And then, silence. The sound of my own breathing. The world was still. The next moment, I opened my eyes. I was back in my apartment. The door was locked. The phone was lying on the floor in front of me, cracked and lifeless. The city outside looked just as it had before, the familiar streetlights flickering in the distance, the sounds of distant traffic carrying through the open window. Everything was normal. But I knew better now. I had escaped. For now. But I knew it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. The shadow would always be waiting, and I would never be able to forget the eyes. Have you ever heard something that you couldn't quite explain? Something that made your skin crawl, but you couldn't bring yourself to investigate? Every night, like clockwork, it happens. It starts with a soft, almost imperceptible noise from above. At first, I thought it was nothing, just the wind, maybe. The house is old, the roof creaks with age, and the trees outside brush against the windows, so I ignored it. I told myself it was just the house settling. But the sound continued, night after night. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. At first, it sounded like the faint scurrying of small feet, something light, nothing to be alarmed about. It would start just after midnight, long after the world outside had fallen silent. A soft padding, like an animal moving cautiously over the roof. I figured it was just some stray cats or maybe a raccoon, creatures looking for shelter or food. I had lived in this neighborhood for a long time, and the occasional animal visit wasn't unheard of. But then, the sounds changed. They started getting louder, more deliberate. The light scurrying turned into something heavier, footsteps, precise and slow. Something was walking on the roof. But not just walking. It would stop, pause, and then take a few more steps. The pacing would follow the same path, as if whatever it was had mapped out a route. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. My curiosity finally pushed me past the point of comfort. I had to know what was up there. I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the back of the house. The ladder leading to the roof was rickety, worn from years of neglect, but it would have to do. I was half expecting to find a few stray cats or perhaps the remnants of some animal's nest. I told myself I was being foolish, that there was no reason to be afraid of a harmless animal. But the unease had settled in my chest by then, a low hum of discomfort that wouldn't go away. The night was unusually still, the air thick with humidity. I steadied myself on the ladder and climbed up slowly, the rungs creaking under my weight. The flashlight beam wavered in my hand, and I felt a prickling on the back of my neck. There was a deep, unsettling quiet up here, no rustling of wind through the trees, no distant sounds from the street. Just silence. When I reached the roof, I froze. The beams of my flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the shingles, the light bouncing off them in sharp angles. For a moment, nothing. No movement, no sounds. Only the steady beat of my heart in my ears. Then, there it was. A shadow moved near the edge of the roof, just out of the corner of my eye. I whipped my flashlight toward it, my hand trembling. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. But then I saw it clearly. A cat. Or at least, it looked like a cat. It was perched on the roof, its back arched slightly as it gazed down at me with wide, glowing eyes. Its fur was dark, almost black, blending with the night. The eyes were the strangest part. They weren't the typical feline glow you'd expect. They were brighter, almost unnatural. They shone like headlights in the darkness, cold and piercing. I took a cautious step forward, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand. My heart skipped a beat when the cat didn't move. It just stared at me, unblinking, its gaze fixed and unnerving. Something about those eyes felt wrong, as though they were seeing more than they should. As though they were staring straight into me, reading my thoughts. I called out softly to it, almost hoping that it was just a normal animal, maybe a neighborhood stray who had wandered too far from home. But the cat didn't respond. It didn't even twitch its tail. I was about to move closer when the wind picked up suddenly, blowing the flashlight beam to the side, obscuring my view. When I adjusted the light again, the cat was gone. My breath caught in my throat. I had been staring at it just seconds ago. Where had it gone? I swept the flashlight across the roof in a panic, my mind racing. The cat couldn't have just vanished. It had been there, clear as day. But now, there was no sign of it. The roof was empty. I didn't know what to do. The logical part of me screamed that it was just a cat, an ordinary, if odd, stray. But the other part of me, the part that couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had settled in my chest, knew something wasn't right. The way it had stared at me. The unnatural glow of its eyes. The way it had just disappeared without a sound. I stood there for a long time, the stillness of the night pressing in on me. The sounds from above had stopped completely now, as if whatever had been walking on the roof had simply vanished into the night. I climbed down the ladder and made my way back into the house, my mind a mess of conflicting thoughts. But as I lay in bed later that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't just seen a cat. Not a normal one, anyway. There was something more to it. Something that didn't belong. And I knew, deep down, that this wouldn't be the last time I would see it. The next few nights were quiet, too quiet. The absence of the strange noises made the silence itself unsettling, like the calm before a storm. I lay awake in bed, the covers tight around me, staring up at the ceiling, waiting for the sounds to return. And they did. It started again the same way, just a soft padding, a faint scurrying on the roof above. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I had imagined it all the night I climbed up. But no! The sound was real, unmistakable. It was as though something, or someone, was pacing back and forth on the roof, each step more deliberate than the last. I couldn't help but feel the pressure building in my chest again. My heartbeat quickened, the familiar unease creeping into my bones. I told myself it was nothing, that the animal from before had returned, but deep down, I knew that this wasn't just a stray cat. It was something else. Something I couldn't explain. I fought the urge to climb back onto the roof. The last time I got up there, I'd seen that cat with the glowing eyes. It had felt like I was being watched, like I wasn't alone, like whatever that thing was, it knew I was there. I didn't want to face it again. But the more I heard the footsteps above me, the more I realized I had no choice. I had to find out what was up there. It was the middle of the night when I grabbed the flashlight again, the cold metal of the ladder pressing against my hands as I made my way up. This time, I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I couldn't explain why I was doing this, why I felt the need to face whatever was haunting me. But the need was undeniable. I stepped onto the roof, the cool night air hitting my face. The usual sounds of the outside world, cars, distant voices, the occasional barking dog, were gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Everything felt different tonight. It was as if the world around me was holding its breath. The sound of footsteps above me was louder now, closer. I turned on my flashlight, scanning the roof. The light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. No cat. No animal. Just the familiar roof, the scattered debris from a storm that had passed days ago. I moved the light again, but there was no sign of the creature I had seen before. Just shadows, dark shapes that seemed to shift and stretch unnaturally in the light. I breathed a sigh of relief, but that relief was short-lived. A low growl echoed through the air. It was so soft at first that I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. But then it came again, closer this time, more menacing. A deep, guttural sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My heart thudded in my chest, and I froze. I didn't dare move. The growl wasn't coming from behind me, where I would expect it to come from if there were an animal lurking, but from directly above me. I slowly raised the flashlight, my hand shaking. As the beam swept across the roof, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. The cat. But it wasn't the same as before. The creature I had seen on the roof a few nights ago had been eerie enough, but this was something else. Its eyes were still glowing, but now they weren't just a faint glow, they were bright, blinding, like lanterns burning in the darkness. The cat's fur was matted and patchy, its body unnaturally thin, as if it had been starved or withered over time. Its claws were extended, long and sharp, glistening in the beam of my flashlight. But it was the eyes that held my gaze. They were no longer just two glowing orbs, they seemed to be pulling me in, drawing me closer, as though they held something beyond my understanding, something ancient and terrifying. It didn't move. It just sat there, watching me. And that's when I realized something else. It wasn't alone. I could feel it, even if I couldn't see it. The roof felt crowded, as if something else was there, something unseen. The air had changed, thickening with an oppressive weight. The growl grew louder, more distinct now. It was coming from all around me, echoing off the walls of the house, reverberating through the roof. The sound wasn't just one growl, it was many, layered on top of each other, like a chorus of deep, primal growls coming from all directions. I took a step back, my pulse racing. But before I could even turn around, I heard it, the sound of something large shifting behind me, moving across the roof, closing the distance between us. The cat didn't move. It just watched. Its eyes didn't blink, didn't waver. I turned quickly, scanning the roof for anything that could be moving. My flashlight flickered, the beam jerking across the shingles. That's why I saw it. A shadow, darker than the night itself, was creeping along the edge of the roof. It was massive, with limbs that seemed too long, too stretched, like they didn't belong to any animal I knew. The shadow slithered closer, its form indistinct, merging with the darkness around it. But the eyes, those eyes, they burned with the same unnatural glow, like twin lanterns floating in the dark. I didn't wait to see any more. I turned and ran, scrambling down the ladder as fast as I could, my mind screaming at me to get away, to escape. When my feet hit the ground, I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran into the house, bolting the door behind me, my chest heaving, my body trembling. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting. The sound of footsteps, soft and measured, echoed from above. They were still up there. And I knew there was no way to escape them. They were coming for me. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle in the trees outside made my heart race. I kept my eyes glued to the ceiling, staring at the cracks in the plaster as though they could offer some kind of answer. What was it? What had I seen on the roof? What was following me? The hours stretched on, each minute heavier than the last. I kept hearing it, that sound, the soft padding of footsteps from above. It had started again, as if it never stopped, like a constant presence in my mind, haunting me even in the safety of my own home. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. Just the wind, just the old house settling. But every time the footsteps stopped and the growl began to echo in the silence, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The next night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to face it. I had to know what was up there, what was watching me from the roof. I stood in the living room, the darkness swallowing the space around me. The house was eerily still, the weight of silence pressing down. I couldn't even hear the faint hum of the streetlights outside. The world felt off. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the back door, stepping onto the porch. The air was damp and cold, the wind rustling through the trees. I climbed the ladder again, each step heavier than the last. My hands shook as I reached the top, my flashlight in a death grip. I paused when I reached the roof, my breath catching in my throat. There it was again, the sound. The soft, deliberate steps, moving in a slow circle above me. But this time, it was different. The growl had stopped. Instead, there was silence, perfect, suffocating silence. The air felt thick, charged, like the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. I moved forward, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the dark. The roof looked empty at first, but my eyes were drawn to the far edge, where the shadows seemed to move unnaturally. And there it was. The cat. But now it wasn't just watching me. It was standing, facing me directly. Its eyes glowed brighter than before, its gaze unwavering, as though it could see right through me. There was no sign of any other creatures, no other shadows lurking in the corners. Just the cat, its glowing eyes boring into mine. And then, I saw it. Behind the cat, the shadows were shifting. I could make out shapes, vague and formless, writhing in the darkness. They moved in and out of the edges of the light, never fully materializing, like whispers of something too terrible to be seen. I tried to move, to step back, but my feet wouldn't cooperate. I was frozen, my gaze locked onto the cat and the shadows behind it. The growl returned, but now it wasn't just one sound. It was a chorus, low, guttural, echoing through the roof like the sound of dozens of creatures lurking just out of sight. The cat's eyes burned brighter, and then it happened. From the shadows, something reached out. A long, twisted limb, covered in what looked like black, matted fur, extended toward me. It was impossibly long, its fingers curling like claws, stretching out to touch me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of the flashlight flickered, barely staying lit, as the shadows seemed to press in on me from all sides. I could feel their presence, hear their movements, but I couldn't see them clearly. They were there, close, too close. And then, I heard it. A voice. It wasn't human. It was deep, guttural, like the sound of something ancient, something that shouldn't exist. The voice whispered my name. Come closer. I shook my head, fighting the terror that threatened to consume me. No, I whispered to myself, but it was as if the voice was inside my mind, urging me forward, drawing me closer to the creature on the roof. I raised the flashlight again, desperately trying to push the beam toward the cat. But the moment the light hit its eyes, they seemed to absorb it, drowning out the glow, leaving only darkness in their wake. The air around me grew colder. The shadows closed in, the whispering voice growing louder, more urgent. And I could hear something else now, footsteps, closer than before. Heavy, slow, deliberate. They were behind me. I could feel them, like a weight pressing on my back. The cat didn't move, but its gaze never wavered. I was trapped. The shadows were all around me now, surrounding me on all sides. I had to get off the roof. I had to get away. I turned, stumbling toward the ladder, the beam of the flashlight barely cutting through the thick air. But as I reached the edge of the roof, the growl returned, this time louder, more vicious. It sounded like it was coming from right above me. I didn't dare look up. I climbed down the ladder as quickly as I could, not caring about the rickety steps beneath my feet. I didn't stop until my feet hit the ground, and I was safely inside the house, the door locked behind me. But the footsteps, they didn't stop. They continued to move above me, as if whatever was up there was still watching, still waiting. I didn't sleep that night. And as I lay there, trembling in the dark, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever that thing was, whatever was haunting me from the roof, it wasn't just a cat. It wasn't just a creature. It was something far worse. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for me. And it wasn't going to stop. The days that followed felt like I was walking through a fog. A thick, suffocating fog that wrapped around me, pulling me deeper into its grasp. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was always just out of reach, watching me from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Each night, the footsteps on the roof returned. At first, I tried to ignore them, pretending they weren't there, hoping that if I ignored them long enough, they would stop. But the growls, they never stopped. They only grew louder, more menacing. And then, there were the whispers. I could hear them, low and insistent, even when I wasn't on the roof. They followed me around the house, seeping into the walls, crawling through the air like a cold mist. Come closer. The voice was always there, always in the background of my thoughts, like a shadow that never left. I couldn't get away from it, no matter how hard I tried. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring back at me, burning into my mind. And the shadows, always moving just out of sight, always just beyond my reach. I tried to tell myself that it was all in my head, that I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew. I knew that whatever was out there on the roof wasn't something I could explain. It wasn't something I could run from. One evening, after another long day of restless waiting, I found myself standing in the backyard, staring up at the roof. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the yard. I could hear the wind rustling through the trees, but there was no sign of the usual noises. No footsteps. No growls. Just silence. And for a moment, it was peaceful. I let myself relax, just for a second. But then, I heard it. A soft shuffle, like something brushing against the shingles. It was faint at first, almost like a trick of the wind. But it grew louder, closer. And then, there it was again. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. But this time, they were different. They weren't the soft padding I heard before. These steps were heavy, deliberate, as if someone, was moving with purpose. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. My eyes shot up to the roof, but I saw nothing. Just the darkening silhouette of the house, the quiet, empty roof. I couldn't see it. I couldn't see them. But I could feel them. They were there, watching. I needed to know. I had to go up there. I didn't care anymore. I couldn't live in this constant state of fear, of not knowing what was lurking just above me. I grabbed the ladder, feeling the familiar weight in my hands as I set it against the side of the house. I started to climb, each step making the air around me feel heavier, more oppressive. The sky was dark now, the stars barely visible through the thick clouds that had begun to gather above. As I reached the top of the ladder, I hesitated. A deep, gnawing fear gripped my chest, but I couldn't turn back now. I had to know what was waiting for me. I stepped onto the roof. The air was colder than before, colder than I remembered. My breath came out in sharp bursts, visible in the chilly night. I lifted the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, but I didn't see anything at first. Just shadows. The roof was empty. But I felt it again. That weight. That presence. Something was there. I could feel it moving around me, just outside of the light. Something watching. And then, from the far corner of the roof, I saw them. A pair of glowing eyes, burning bright in the darkness. They stared at me, unblinking, unrelenting. The cat. It was there again, sitting perfectly still, its eyes locked onto mine. But now, it was different. It was no longer just a cat. It was something more. The eyes were wider now, unnatural, as if they had stretched to fit the darkness. The pupils were narrow slits, gleaming like knives. And the shadows around it, they moved. Twisted. They were not shadows at all, but something darker, more sinister. They reached out toward me, curling like tendrils, stretching farther with each passing second. The growl came again, deep and resonant, filling the air with its terrifying vibration. But it wasn't just one growl. It was many. Dozens of growls, layered on top of each other, rising up like a chorus of something ancient, something hungry. The cat stood up, its movements slow and deliberate. It didn't run, didn't flee. It walked toward me, its eyes never leaving mine, its body stretched and thin, like it had been twisted into something unrecognizable. And that's when I saw it. Behind the cat, something was emerging from the shadows. Something large, its form shifting and changing, like smoke or mist, its shape barely discernible in the dark. But the eyes, those glowing eyes, they were everywhere, burning like fire. I stepped back, my legs unsteady, my body trembling. The creature, whatever it was moving closer now. The shadows were all around me, pulling me in, suffocating the light. The voice returned, whispering in my ear, cold and venomous. "Come closer." I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran, the beam of my flashlight jerking wildly, illuminating nothing but the vast, empty roof. I scrambled down the ladder, my hands slipping on the rungs, my feet barely finding purchase. The growls, the footsteps, the whispers, they were all around me, closing in, chasing me back into the house. I slammed the door behind me, my chest heaving with the force of my breaths. But the footsteps didn't stop. They continued above me, slow and deliberate, like a clock counting down the seconds. Whatever was up there, whatever had been following me, it wasn't done yet. And this time, I wasn't sure I'd survive it. The nights had become unbearable. Every hour spent in that house felt like I was suffocating, trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't let go. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyes, burning, relentless, staring at me from the darkness. And I could hear them. The footsteps, the growls, the whispers, all of it closing in. But tonight was different. I had decided that I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't continue waiting for something to happen. Something had to give. Either I would find a way to end it or it would end me. I gathered every ounce of courage I had left and prepared myself. The flashlight in my hand felt heavier now, almost like an anchor, keeping me grounded in a reality I wasn't sure existed anymore. I knew what I had to do. I had to face it, whatever it was, head on. I stood at the base of the ladder, my breath shaky, but my resolve firm. The night was colder than ever, the air thick with the weight of things unsaid, things unknown. I could feel the presence again, not just above me, but everywhere, pressing in, clawing at the edges of my mind. As I climbed, I tried to push the panic aside. My hands trembled, but I refused to stop. The air was sharp, like ice against my skin, and the sound of my heart pounding in my ears drowned out the usual noises of the night. But just when I reached the top, everything went dead silent. The world around me seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The roof was as dark as ever, the shadows sprawling like ink across the surface. I shone the flashlight around, my hands moving in erratic circles, but the beam barely cut through the overwhelming darkness. It was as if the light was being swallowed by the very air itself. And then I heard it. A soft, slow creak. It came from behind me. I whirled around, the beam of the flashlight slicing through the blackness, but there was nothing. The roof was empty. Silent. I took a step back, my pulse racing, sweat trickling down my neck. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee, but I refused to give in. I was done with running. I forced myself to step further onto the roof, the air colder with each movement. And that's when I saw it, those eyes. Glowing faintly at first, but growing brighter, larger, until they were burning like twin orbs of fire, watching me from the far corner of the roof. The cat. But this time, it wasn't just the cat. Behind it, the shadows moved again, this time more violently, more purposefully. And in those shadows, I could make out shapes, large, dark figures, things, perhaps, or creatures that didn't belong in this world. They shifted in and out of existence, like smoke caught in a windstorm, but they were real. I could feel them. The cat stood perfectly still, its body taut and its eyes locked on me, unblinking, unfeeling. But the presence behind it, that was what terrified me. It was like the cat was a sentinel, a guardian of something worse, something more powerful. I could hear it, like the wind howling, but deeper, more guttural, like 1,000 voices calling to me from a place I didn't want to know. And the whispers. They were back. Come closer. I stepped forward, but my legs were shaking. I wasn't sure if it was the cold or the overwhelming fear. The air was thick now, so thick that I could barely breathe. Each step I took felt like I was moving through mud, as though something was trying to pull me down, to drag me into the dark. But I had to do this. I had to get closer. I was almost there, just a few feet away from the cat when it finally moved. It wasn't a graceful leap or a subtle step. No. It was an explosion of motion, a blur of fur and shadow, and before I could react, it was right in front of me, its glowing eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I knew. This wasn't just a cat. This was something else. Something ancient. The shadows twisted and coiled around me, enveloping me. I could feel the temperature drop, feel the cold seep into my bones. The whispers became louder, more desperate, like they were speaking directly into my mind. Come closer. I reached out, unable to stop myself. My hand was trembling, but it was as if some unseen force was guiding me, pulling me toward those burning eyes. And when my hand finally touched the cat, it wasn't warm. It wasn't even solid. It was cold. Cold as death. And then, it was like the world shattered. The shadows crashed in around me, clawing, tugging, pulling. The sound of growls became deafening, like an entire army of creatures surrounding me, and I was drowning in it. I couldn't see. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The shadows withdrew. The growls ceased. The whispers faded into nothingness. And there I was, standing on the roof, alone, the cat nowhere to be seen. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my mind spinning. My hands were shaking violently, my heart thundering in my chest. I couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Had it been a dream? Had it been real? I didn't know anymore. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't care how. I didn't care where. I just needed to get away from the roof, from the house, from whatever had just happened. But as I reached the ladder, I stopped. I looked up at the roof, the place that had haunted me for so long. It was quiet. Too quiet. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it again, those glowing eyes, watching from the darkness. And this time, I understood. It wasn't just a cat. It was the thing that would never let me go. The thing that would follow me forever. Have you ever thought about what you would do if you could see the future? What if you had the power to change it, to prevent terrible things from happening? Sounds like a blessing, right? But what if that blessing was more like a curse? I found a camera. Not just any camera, but one that, for reasons I still can't explain, shows things that haven't happened yet. I was walking home from work on a quiet street lined with old shops and apartment buildings when I stumbled upon it. It was wedged between some trash cans, hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers. The camera, covered in dust and dirt, looked like something out of a forgotten era, an old film camera with a leather strap. The lens was cracked, but it still seemed intact. Maybe it was just curiosity or the need to find something interesting in a boring day, but I took it. At first, I thought it was just a strange old relic. But then something happened that changed everything. That night, I decided to give it a try. The camera seemed too strange, too out of place, and I couldn't resist taking a photo of my living room just to see if it worked. The shutter clicked with an odd, almost mechanical sound, and the picture slowly began to develop in front of my eyes. What appeared on the photo made my stomach turn. It was my living room, but it wasn't quite right. The furniture was rearranged, and there was something wrong with the shadows. They looked too sharp, too harsh. But what made my heart stop was the figure in the corner of the room. It was me, or at least it looked like me, but my face was twisted in terror, my mouth open as if screaming. I stared at the photo, the blood draining from my face. It couldn't be real. It didn't make sense. How could a camera show a future that hadn't happened yet? But there it was, right in front of me. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the unease creeping up my spine. I had to be imagining things. Maybe it was just a glitch, a weird fluke of the camera. But then, I saw it again. The next photo I took, this time of the street outside my window, was equally disturbing. The same strange, sharp shadows. And in the distance, a dark figure standing motionless, facing directly toward my window. The figure was too far away to make out any details, but the sense of dread was unmistakable. I dropped the camera, my hands shaking, but I knew that this wasn't just a coincidence. It was as if the camera had captured something beyond what I could see, something I wasn't meant to know. I had to make sense of it. I had to understand what was happening. But with each photograph I took, I could see more of what was going to happen, and every single image was worse than the last. In one picture, I saw myself at work, sitting in my office. But I was no longer alone. There was someone, or something, standing behind me. A tall, shadowy figure with no face. Its hands reached toward my shoulders. In another photo, I saw the same shadowy figure, only this time it was standing at the foot of my bed. And it was closer. I could almost feel its presence, like it was in the room with me, just waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to stop. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I could just throw the camera away and forget about it. But each photo pulled me deeper, showed me things that I couldn't ignore. And with every passing moment, the pictures started to feel more real. The scenes weren't just images anymore. They were warnings. Visions of things that were going to happen. I tried everything to stop it. I went to the police. I tried to destroy the camera. But nothing worked. Each time I thought I had escaped, I'd take another photo, and there it was, another glimpse into a nightmare that hadn't happened yet. I couldn't stop it. And now, as I sit here in my apartment, my hands trembling as I hold the last photograph, one I haven't shown anyone yet, I'm starting to understand that I never could. The figure in the photo, the one who's always lurking, always watching, has come closer. It's right outside my door now. And this time, it's smiling. I should have burned the camera. I should have thrown it away the moment I realized what it was capable of. But something inside me, something dark and curious, kept pulling me back to it. It was like I couldn't look away from a car crash. Every time I saw a new photo, I felt an inexplicable need to know what came next, to understand the consequences of what was happening. But now I wish I hadn't. That last photograph, the one with the figure smiling outside my door, it had already begun to unfold. I hadn't opened the door. I couldn't bring myself to. But I could hear something. A faint scraping, like claws dragging against wood, slow and deliberate. It wasn't the sound of a person. It wasn't even the sound of an animal. It was something else, something unnatural. I sat on the floor, back pressed against the wall, the camera in my hands, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of my mind. The noise outside continued, getting louder, closer. Each scraping sound punctuated by a soft, raspy breath that sent chills down my spine. And then, it stopped. The silence was deafening. It hung in the air, thick and heavy, as if the world had paused, waiting for something to happen. I waited too, frozen in place, my heart racing. My eyes kept darting to the photo on the floor, the one with the figure, smiling in the darkness. The longer I stared at it, the more I could almost feel its presence, the same way you feel someone staring at you from across the room, even when you can't see them. It was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to open the door. I had to know what was on the other side. I stood up, my legs shaky, and I walked to the door, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the handle, my breath caught in my throat. The door felt cold under my hand, colder than it should have been. It was as if the very air around me had turned to ice. Slowly, I turned the handle. The door creaked open, just a crack. I held my breath, my eyes straining to see through the darkness outside. But there was nothing. Nothing at all. The hallway was empty. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe it was just my paranoia, my fear taking control of me. But then I saw something on the floor, something that hadn't been there before. A photograph. I bent down to pick it up, my heart pounding in my chest. It was the same image. But this time, it wasn't just the figure in the corner. This time, it was me lying in the hallway, bloodied and motionless. My face was twisted in terror, just like the one in the earlier photo. My breath hitched to my throat. The photo was clear. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a mistake. I felt my stomach drop. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't change it. The camera wasn't just showing me glimpses of the future. It was shaping it. As if on cue, the door slammed shut behind me with a force so violent that I stumbled backwards. The noise was deafening, and I could feel the air shift as if something had moved in the room with me. I was no longer alone. I turned around to face the darkness, my mind racing. I could hear movement again, scraping, dragging, coming closer. It was right outside the door, just on the other side. The sound of breath, wet and heavy, filled the space. It's real, I thought. It's really happening. I ran to the window, throwing the blinds open, desperate for escape. But the street outside was empty, silent. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then I saw it, a shadow moving swiftly, too fast to be human. It was there, just in the corner of my eye, a blur of movement. I snapped my head back toward the door, heart in my throat. It was here. The scraping noise grew louder. Closer. I could feel its presence like a physical weight pushing against the door. I backed away slowly, my legs feeling like they were made of lead, but my eyes were locked on the door, waiting for it to open. And then it did. The door creaked open, just slightly, and through the gap, I saw it. The figure. It wasn't the shadow I had seen before. It wasn't the faceless thing that had haunted my photos. This one had a face. And it was smiling. A grotesque, twisted grin stretching far beyond the human limits. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, glowing faintly in the dark. I froze. It didn't move at first. It just stood there, staring at me with that smile. And then it whispered, "You can't escape." The air seemed to grow colder, the room darker, as if it was swallowing the light around me. I tried to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, trapped in place by that smile. And then the camera flashed in my hand. I hadn't meant to take the photo, but I had. The flash was blinding, but when it faded, I looked down at the image in my hands. And it was me, standing in front of the thing. My face was calm, almost peaceful, as I faced the creature with that same twisted grin. I wasn't running. I wasn't fighting. I was accepting it. And in that moment, I realized the truth. I wasn't controlling the future. The future was controlling me. I couldn't breathe. The photo trembled in my hands, the image of me, standing there, perfectly still in front of the thing with the glowing eyes, seared into my mind. I didn't even remember taking the picture. My body had moved of its own accord, as if it had already accepted the fate I was trying so desperately to outrun. I dropped the camera. It fell to the floor with a dull thud, the lens cracked further. The creature didn't move. Its grin stretched wider, if that was even possible. The air in the room felt heavier, like it was pressing on me from all sides. The shadows around the door seemed to deepen, as if they were crawling in, folding themselves into every corner of the room. And then, the whisper again. "You cannot stop it." I couldn't make my legs move. I stood there, paralyzed, my eyes glued to the doorway. The creature, or whatever it was, didn't come closer, but it didn't have to. I could feel it inside me. The fear had settled into my bones, crawling beneath my skin, spreading through every muscle and nerve. For a long time, neither of us moved. The silence between us was suffocating, but I didn't dare look away. I knew that if I did, something worse would happen. Then, like a sudden snap, the air around me shifted. The creature was gone. The door, which had been cracked open, was now fully closed. The shadows in the room seemed to retreat, leaving only a cold emptiness behind. But it wasn't over. I knew it wasn't over. I grabbed the camera again, my hands shaking as I lifted it. The photo I had just taken, the one with me standing in front of the creature, was gone. The film had developed, but there was nothing on it. It was blank. I checked the next one, then the next, and the next. All the photos had vanished. The film was empty. For a moment, I thought I had lost my mind. Maybe I had imagined it all, the creature, the whispers, the photos. Maybe I was just losing touch with reality. But then I saw it. On the back of the camera, faint but unmistakable, were the words, "The future cannot be erased." I stumbled back, dropping the camera again. The words burned into my mind, but there was no time to think. The room had changed. The atmosphere, once stifling, had become alive. It was like the walls were closing in, the air thickening, pressing against me. I reached for my phone, but the screen was black. The power had drained. The clock, which had been ticking steadily a moment ago, had stopped. It was as if time itself had frozen. But the silence was broken again. This time, it wasn't the whisper. It was the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and too heavy for a human to make. The sound echoed through the room, growing closer, step by step. I turned toward the door, my heart pounding, but I couldn't see anything. The steps continued, getting louder, until they were right outside the door. I ran to the window, throwing it open. I looked down at the street below, hoping for some sign of life, someone who could help. But the street was empty. Silent. I turned back toward the room, panic rising in my chest. The footsteps were inside. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I turned, searching for something, anything, that could help me, but the room was bare. There was nothing. Nothing but the photos, scattered on the floor, all showing the same thing, me. Each photo was a snapshot of my own destruction, each one showing me in different places, different moments, but always the same inevitable ending. My face twisted in horror. My body crumpled. My life unraveling before my eyes. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could feel them now, the vibrations beneath my feet. I turned toward the door, my body trembling. And then the door burst open. But there was nothing there. Just empty space. The room was silent once more, but I knew it was coming. It always did. It was only a matter of time before it showed up again. But this time, I was ready. I grabbed the camera one last time, determined to capture it, to see the future before it could reach me. I raised it to my eye, my hand trembling as I framed the shot. And then, the flash. The photo developed slowly in front of me, the image coming into focus. It was me, standing alone in the room, just like before. But this time, something was different. Behind me, in the shadows, I saw it. The creature. Its eyes glowing faintly, its mouth stretched into a grin. It was right behind me, its hand reaching out toward my shoulder, the fingers long and clawed, inches away from touching me. I knew then what was happening. The camera wasn't just showing the future, it was creating it. Each time I took a photo, I was writing my own fate. And no matter how hard I tried to escape, no matter how many times I changed the picture, the future always found me. It always led me here. To the same ending. To the same inevitable fate. And now, I understood. There was no escaping the future. It had already been written. And no matter how many times I tried to stop it, I would always be there, waiting for the flash. I had lost track of time. How long had I been staring at the photo? Minutes? Hours? The creature in the picture seemed to be closer than before, its eyes burning with an unnatural intensity, its hand stretched almost to the point of contact. But that wasn't what terrified me the most. What truly frightened me was the growing sense of inevitability, the feeling that no matter what I did, no matter how hard I fought, I was bound to this path. The future, the one the camera showed me, was unchangeable. I wasn't making decisions anymore, I was merely witnessing what was already fated to happen. The photo held in my shaking hands was proof. It was as if the camera had captured my soul, imprisoning me in a loop of horror. I turned it over, half expecting to see the same cryptic message. But instead, the back was empty. It was then that I realized the camera wasn't just showing the future, it was feeding on it. Each flash, each photo, was a fragment of the coming terror, and by looking at them, I was complicit in the unfolding disaster. My dread didn't stop with the photos, it was seeping into every moment of my life, twisting my perception of reality. I dropped the camera to the floor, its cracked lens now facing up at me like a cursed eye. But I couldn't take my eyes off it. What if I had the power to change it? What if the key to breaking this cycle was hidden in the images themselves? I was desperate. Desperate enough to believe there was hope. But deep down, I knew better. There was no changing this. No escape. I tried to force myself to move, to leave the room, but my legs were stiff, my body paralyzed. The air was thick with dread. My breath quickened as I realized I could hear the footsteps again. This time, they weren't just outside the door. They were moving in the room, circling me. I could feel them, feel their presence, pressing in from every corner, from every shadow. I looked up, and there it was. The creature. It was standing there, in the doorway, grinning at me with that grotesque smile. Its eyes were wide and burning, the pupils glowing like two pale suns in the dark room. Its hand reached out toward me again, but it wasn't a gentle movement. It was slow, deliberate, like it knew I couldn't escape, like it knew I was trapped in its grasp. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The camera was still lying on the floor, but the creature didn't seem to notice. It kept its gaze fixed on me, and I could feel the weight of its stare pressing down on me, suffocating me. There was no escape. It reached out, and I felt its cold fingers brush against my skin. A shock of icy terror ran through my spine, and for a split second, I thought I was going to pass out. But the creature's touch wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was the sound of its fingers scraping against my flesh, a sound like nails dragging across a chalkboard, like something unnatural. I screamed, trying to pull away, but the creature's grip tightened. The world around me began to twist, to spiral out of focus, as if the very fabric of reality was breaking apart. The photos flashed before my eyes, each one a new snapshot of my demise. I saw myself crumpled on the floor, my body twisted and broken. I saw myself standing alone in a dark alley, with the creature's eyes burning into me from the shadows. And then I saw something else, something new. It was a photo of me, holding the camera in my hand, with a smile on my face. I stared at the image, confused. How could that be possible? The smile on my face was one of victory, of knowing that I had overcome it, that I had escaped the cycle. But that wasn't real, was it? It was just another trick. Another false hope. And then I heard it again, the whisper, colder than ever. There is no escape. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room was spinning now, the walls warping and breathing, closing in on me. The creature was behind me, its breath hot against the back of my neck, and I felt its fingers on my spine. In that moment, I realized the truth. There was no way out of this. The future was already here, already unfolding. I had been consumed by the camera's power, and no matter how many times I tried to change the course of events, it always led back here, to the same inevitable end. I looked at the camera one last time. The lens was cracked, the film was gone, but it didn't matter. The future had already been sealed. I had already made my choice the moment I picked it up. And now, there was nothing left to do but wait. Wait for the next flash. Wait for the next photo. Wait for the creature to claim me, just like it had claimed everyone before me. I was a part of the cycle now, and there would be no escape. The end was written, and it was coming for me. I tried to move, to stand, but my body refused to obey. It felt as though the ground beneath me had turned to quicksand, each step pulling me deeper into a void. The creature's presence loomed over me like a dark cloud, its burning eyes watching, waiting for the inevitable. There was no running. No more fighting. I had lost. The photos from the camera had scattered across the floor, each one a vivid, inescapable truth. A collection of my fate, captured in a moment of time. I could no longer tell what was real and what was just a glimpse of my doom. My head spun as I desperately tried to pull myself from the paralysis that gripped me, but it was as if my limbs were frozen, held in place by the weight of the creature's gaze. It knows, I thought. It knows what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling. And that was the final blow. The realization that I had become part of a story far larger than myself, a story whose end had already been written. The camera had not just shown me the future, it had crafted it, woven me into its dark narrative. The creature stepped closer, its breath cold against my neck. I could feel the icy tendrils of fear wrapping around my heart, tightening with each passing second. It reached down and picked up one of the photos from the floor, holding it in front of my face. The image blurred in and out, as if the very act of viewing it was a violation of some forbidden truth. The photo was different now. The grin that had been on my face in the last image was gone. In its place, there was nothing but a hollow, vacant expression. A blank stare. It was as if the camera had captured something even worse than my death, the moment my soul was erased. The moment I ceased to exist in any real sense. And yet, the creature smiled. It wasn't a human smile. It wasn't even a smile at all. It was a grotesque, malicious curling of its lips, like the crackling of something dark and ancient, something that had been buried and forgotten, now emerging from the depths to claim what was rightfully its. "You are mine now," it whispered, its voice a guttural growl that seemed to echo from every corner of the room. "And so is everyone who comes after you." The words sank into me like a weight, heavy and suffocating. It was as if I had been swallowed by the very darkness that had been closing in on me all along. There was no fight left in me. No hope. Only the cold, indifferent truth that I was trapped in a nightmare that would never end. The camera, the photos, the creature, they were all part of the same twisted game. A game that no one could win. A game that had been set into motion long before I ever picked up the cursed object. The future had been sealed the moment the camera had first flashed, and now I was just one more casualty in its long line of victims. But even as the creature reached out to claim me, to drag me into the abyss, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. It was another photo. A new one. A photo I hadn't seen before. It was a picture of my own hand, reaching for the camera. I stared at it, heart pounding in my chest. How was this possible? I had already dropped the camera. I wasn't holding it anymore. Yet here it was, the photograph of me reaching for it once again, as if my fate had already been decided. I realized then that the camera wasn't just a tool, it was a prison. A trap that played on my own desperation. It showed me the future, but it also created the future. Every attempt to change what was coming only strengthened the cycle, tightening its grip around me like a vice. "You can't escape," the creature whispered, its voice like the rustle of leaves in the wind. "You've already made your choice. Now, you'll always be a part of it." The room began to distort, the walls closing in around me, the edges of reality bending and warping. I could feel myself slipping away, becoming one with the nightmare. The creature was no longer just a presence, it was everywhere, in the air, in the walls, in the very fabric of time itself. I could hear its laughter, dark and hollow, echoing through the abyss. And then, in the final moment before I was consumed completely, I saw one last photo. This one, though, was different. It wasn't a picture of the creature. It wasn't a picture of me. It was a picture of the camera itself, sitting abandoned in the center of an empty room. The flash had stopped. And that, somehow, terrified me even more than anything that had come before. The camera had finished with me. The cycle was complete. And now, it would start again. For someone else. The end had already been written. And this time, there was no way to stop it. Have you ever wondered what would happen if something that didn't belong in the world crept up behind you, silently watching as you went about your daily life? A shadow that wasn't cast by anything real, a presence that seemed to breathe with the night air, following you, waiting for the right moment to show itself. I didn't think much of it at first. The first time I noticed it, I thought I was simply imagining things. It was late, well past midnight, and the streets were empty except for me. I was walking home from the late shift, the familiar path lined with worn-out buildings and old streetlights. The hum of the city had died down, leaving only the occasional distant car or the rustle of wind through the trees. And then I saw it, a shadow, cast beneath the streetlight, where there was no one standing. It wasn't like the usual shadows, stretching away from the light, flickering as the night breeze moved. No, this shadow stood still. Perfectly still, like it was waiting for something. I paused for a moment, narrowing my eyes. The streetlight buzzed faintly above it, its dull yellow glow painting the sidewalk in a sickly light. I looked around, but the street was deserted. No one else was there, and yet the shadow remained. It was strange, but I shrugged it off. Shadows play tricks in the dark, I told myself. Maybe it was just an odd reflection or the result of some obscure angle of light. After all, I had seen strange things before, and they often disappeared when I looked at them more closely. But the next night, it was there again. The same spot, beneath the same streetlight, the shadow stretching just a little longer this time. I stopped and stared at it, trying to understand. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't just the shadow. There was something else. Something off. It was as if the world around me had started to lose its edges, like the darkness was seeping into the very fabric of the night. I didn't want to believe it, but there was a sense of something watching me, something waiting for the right moment. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the unease. The shadow didn't move. It remained where it had been, perfectly still beneath the light. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was following me. I dared not look back. The days that followed were uneventful, but the sense of something lurking in the dark grew stronger. I began to notice other strange things. The way the wind would stop when I walked past that particular streetlight. The way the shadows seemed just a little too long, just a little too sharp. Each night, the shadow beneath the light grew a little more distinct, a little darker, a little larger. It didn't take long before I couldn't ignore it anymore. One night, as I passed the streetlight, I heard something, a faint rustle, a shift in the air. A subtle sound, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make me freeze in my tracks. My breath caught in my throat. The shadow had moved. It wasn't just there anymore, it had stretched across the ground further than it ever had before. Impossible. My heart raced, and I turned around. The streetlight flickered, casting long, distorted shapes across the pavement. The shadow, it was no longer simply lying there. It was standing, shifting, becoming a shape, a figure. I stumbled backward, unable to take my eyes off it. The shadow began to grow taller, and with it, I saw something else, eyes. Two burning, unblinking eyes, glowing like embers in the dark. They weren't just in the shadow. They were the shadow. And then, it moved. The thing beneath the light, the shape that wasn't really a shape, began to shift, slowly, deliberately, until it had taken form. I wanted to run, but my feet felt like lead. I couldn't tear my gaze away from those eyes. They seemed to pull me in, to trap me. That's when I realized it wasn't just following me anymore. It was alive. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, staring into those glowing eyes. It felt like time itself had stopped, like the world around me had collapsed into that single moment where the only thing that mattered was the figure beneath the streetlight. The longer I looked, the more real it seemed. It wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just darkness. It was something alive, something watching, something waiting. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow shrank back into its original form. It fell to the ground, pooling beneath the streetlight once more, silent and still. But I knew it wasn't gone. It was still there, just out of sight, biding its time. My breath was shallow, my chest tight with fear. I forced my legs to move, to take a step, then another, until I was walking briskly away. I didn't dare look back. The streets were still empty, but now the silence felt oppressive, as though the night itself was holding its breath. I had to get home. I had to get away from the streetlight. But even as I quickened my pace, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if the shadow had followed me, lingering just out of sight, hidden in the corners of my vision. My heart hammered in my chest, and I fought the urge to look over my shoulder. When I reached my apartment, I slammed the door shut behind me, leaning against it as if that would keep whatever I had seen out. The apartment was empty, quiet, the kind of silence that felt like it was pressing in from all sides. I needed to calm down. I needed to think. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that it was just a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. But the more I thought about it, the less I believed that. The shadow wasn't a trick. It had been too real, too distinct. Those eyes, I could still see them, burned into my mind. I couldn't shake the image of them, glowing with a cold, unnatural light. I had to know what was happening. I had to figure out what that thing was and why it was following me. The next night, I decided to face it. I wasn't sure what I hoped to accomplish. Maybe I thought I could stop it, somehow, confront it head on and make it go away. But as I left my apartment and stepped out into the street again, I could already feel the weight of the night pressing down on me. The air was thick, heavy with the sense that something was waiting just beyond the horizon. When I reached the streetlight, I saw it again. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The shadow was still, just as it had been the first time. But then, the air shifted. The streetlight flickered once, twice, before going dark altogether. The sudden darkness felt suffocating, as though it was closing in on me. My pulse quickened. I heard it then, a low, guttural sound like the rustling of something moving through the darkness. And then, the shadow began to shift again, growing larger, stretching toward me. I didn't have time to think. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement as I raced down the empty street. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart beating erratically in my chest. The sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, echoed behind me. I couldn't outrun it. I reached the alley, my only hope for escape, but as I glanced behind me, I saw something I couldn't understand. The shadow wasn't just following me, it was catching up. It was moving with an unnatural speed, like it was alive, its form shifting and stretching as it closed in. Panic surged through me, and I ran harder, faster, but the alleyway seemed to stretch on forever. Every time I looked back, the shadow was a step closer, its glowing eyes burning through the dark. The sound of its movement was relentless, a low, rasping noise that grew louder with every passing second. I reached the end of the alley, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped. I turned, ready to face whatever was coming for me, but then, silence. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just the empty street, the dim glow of the far-off streetlights, and the pounding of my heart in my ears. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. And then, from the shadows, it appeared again. The figure, the shape, the thing beneath the light. It was standing at the other end of the alley, watching me with those same unblinking eyes. I was too afraid to move, too terrified to scream. The shadow inched closer, its form growing more solid, more defined with each step it took. I couldn't escape. I couldn't fight it. The closer it got, the more I could see it, a figure that was no longer just a shadow, but a creature made of darkness, its eyes glowing with a cold, cruel light. And then it spoke. "You can't outrun what you are." The words cut through the silence, a cold whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I froze. My blood ran cold. The shadow reached out, and I knew, in that instant, that I had nowhere left to hide. The shadow's words echoed in my mind, lingering like a nightmare I couldn't shake. "You can't outrun what you are." What did it mean? Was it talking about me? Was I the one it was hunting, or was it something deeper, something tied to the darkness itself? I stood there, unable to move, my mind spinning in a vortex of confusion and fear. The creature, a thing made of shadow and cold light, was only a few feet away now, its presence suffocating, its eyes burning through the darkness. I could feel the weight of its gaze, as if it could see into my very soul. I didn't understand. I didn't know what was happening, why this thing had come for me, or how it knew my every step. All I knew was that it was here, and it wasn't going to leave until it had what it wanted. Without thinking, I spun around and ran again, as if my legs were moving on their own. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hardly hear anything else. The world around me blurred as I tore down the alley, but I could still feel it behind me, that presence, slowly following, but unyielding. I reached the end of the alley and turned the corner, gasping for breath, trying to stay ahead of it. The night air was cold, biting, and I felt the sharp sting of the wind against my skin, but it did nothing to dull the terror surging through me. I couldn't let it catch me. I couldn't let it win. The street was empty. The houses on either side were dark, lifeless, as if the entire world had abandoned me. My footsteps echoed in the silence, a constant reminder of my fragility. But there was no escaping the feeling that something was closing in on me. I risked a glance over my shoulder. For a split second, I thought I had lost it. There was nothing. No shadow, no glowing eyes. Just the dark street behind me. But then, it moved. The shadow didn't just appear. It suddenly loomed in front of me, materializing from the darkness like some sick trick of the night. Its shape flickered and shifted, stretching and shrinking in the way only something unnatural could. I stopped dead in my tracks. My breath caught in my throat. It was right there, closer than it had ever been before. It loomed over me, its eyes glowing with that same sickening light. And again, it spoke, its voice a rasping whisper that slid through the air like the very essence of fear itself. You can't run forever. I didn't know what to do. There was nowhere left to go. No escape. The street was empty. The only sound now was my own heartbeat, pounding so loudly it felt like it might burst through my chest. I could feel its presence, thick and suffocating, wrapping around me, pressing in on me from every direction. Why are you doing this? I whispered, my voice trembling, barely a sound in the stillness. For a moment, there was only silence. The shadow didn't move, didn't make a sound. But then, just as quickly, it answered. You called me. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. What? I gasped. I didn't call you. I don't even know what you are. The shadow seemed to shift again, almost as if it were amused by my confusion. The glow in its eyes flickered, brighter now, more intense. You don't remember? The voice was mocking, twisted, like a sinister laugh hidden in every word. The things you saw. The things you ignored. I couldn't understand. My mind was racing, but it felt like it was closing in on itself, my thoughts scattered, tangled. I had to remember, there had to be something that could explain why this was happening. And then it hit me. The camera. The photos. I had thought they were just random shots, just strange coincidences, but now I realized. The photos had been showing me the future. It had been right there in front of me all along. The shadow, the presence, it had been following me all along. I had seen it. I took a step back, my eyes wide with horror. No, I whispered. No, I didn't ask for this. But the shadow's form was already shifting again. It was coming closer, its presence closing in like a wave about to crash. I didn't know what to do. There was no fight in me. There was no escape. And then, as if on cue, the light flickered again, and everything went black. I wasn't sure how long I stood there in the dark, but when the light finally returned, the shadow was gone. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. Maybe it was all just a dream. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel it, still lingering somewhere in the darkness, watching me, waiting for the next step. And I knew, without a doubt, it wouldn't be long before it came for me again. The darkness had returned. Not in the way it should have, but in a way that made the air thick, heavy, almost suffocating. The light from the street lamp was dimmer now, flickering as if it were losing the battle against the overwhelming blackness around me. But I wasn't imagining it this time. The shadow had left its mark. Its presence was still there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. I took a cautious step forward, my legs weak beneath me. I could hear the steady pounding of my heart in my ears, louder than ever, drowning out the sounds of the night. I couldn't shake the feeling that the world around me was bending, stretching, warping in ways it shouldn't. I glanced down at the ground, hoping to see something familiar, something that could ground me. But the pavement was cracked, warped, like a reflection in a broken mirror. I couldn't recognize anything anymore. It was all wrong. I knew I had to move. I couldn't stay here. Not with that thing out there, hiding in the dark, ready to consume me. But where could I go? I turned, looking up the street, but it was as empty and silent as before. I felt trapped in some kind of nightmare where nothing was as it seemed. I couldn't even trust the ground beneath my feet, nor the sky above. The fear had taken hold of me now, twisting my thoughts, pulling at my sanity. I didn't know if I was still in the real world, or if this was all part of something more sinister. My hand trembled as I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the camera. It felt heavier than it had before, the metal cold against my fingers. I didn't want to look at the photos. I didn't want to see what would happen next. But deep down, I knew I had no choice. I had to know. I had to understand what was coming. With shaking hands, I flicked through the pictures, the images now more vivid, more detailed. Each photo was worse than the last. Faces distorted in terror, buildings crumbling, streets consumed by fire. But there was one that stood out among the rest. One image that sent a shiver down my spine. It was a photo of me, standing in the middle of the street, my face pale with fear, eyes wide. And behind me, the shadow. Its form was even more terrifying now, stretching up, reaching for me. Its glowing eyes were locked onto mine. I felt my breath catch in my throat. This was it. This was the moment. I couldn't stop it. I had tried to change the future, to outrun it, but the photos kept showing me the same thing. And now, here I was, living it. I wasn't just being followed anymore. I was being hunted. A sound broke through my thoughts, a low, rasping noise, like something dragging across the ground. The sound grew louder, closer, as though the shadow was moving, stalking me, just out of sight. I snapped my head around, heart racing. Nothing. But then I saw it. A figure, standing under the dim light of the street lamp. It wasn't quite human, not anymore. The edges of its form were blurred, shifting in the flickering light. Its eyes, those burning, glowing eyes, stared directly at me. I froze, unable to move, my entire body locked in place by terror. The shadow didn't speak this time. It didn't need to. I could feel its presence more than ever, pressing in around me like a weight I couldn't escape. And then it moved. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over my own feet, but the shadow was faster. It reached for me, its tendrils of darkness extending, curling like fingers, and I knew it wouldn't stop until it had me. I had no time. I had to make a choice. I bolted. My legs burned as I ran, adrenaline coursing through my veins, but the shadow was faster, always just behind me, closer and closer with every step. I could hear its breath now, a low, hissing sound that seemed to come from all around me, echoing in my skull. I couldn't see where I was going anymore. The world had become a blur, just the pounding of my heart and the sound of its pursuit. I turned a corner, desperate, hoping to lose it in the maze of alleyways. But as I rounded the bend, I skidded to a halt. The shadow was already there. It filled the entire street, blocking every possible escape. There was nowhere left to run. And then it spoke, its voice now cold, final. You can't escape yourself. The words pierced through me like ice, sending a wave of nausea crashing over me. I understood now. The shadow wasn't just hunting me. It was me. The darkness I had tried to outrun, the fear I had buried deep inside, it had taken shape. It was a reflection of everything I had ignored, every mistake I had made. I was trapped in a nightmare of my own creation, and there was no way out. The shadow moved closer, and this time I didn't run. There was nothing left to fear. Only the cold, inevitable embrace of the darkness. The world seemed to collapse around me, a suffocating blackness enveloping my body, pulling me deeper into the darkness where nothing else existed. It was as though time itself had stopped, no more sounds, no more thoughts, just the endless weight pressing down on me, drowning me in its silence. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only feel the coldness, the emptiness. And then, nothing. For a moment, I thought I was dead. I wasn't sure what was real anymore, if anything ever had been. But slowly, the fog in my mind began to lift. I could hear the faint sound of wind brushing against my skin, the faint crackle of static in the air. The world was slowly coming back into focus, but it was different. The streetlight was still there, flickering faintly in the distance, but everything else had changed. The world seemed off. The air smelled wrong. The pavement beneath my feet felt unfamiliar, like I was walking on a surface that wasn't made for this world. And the shadow, it was still there, but not in the same way. It was no longer chasing me, it was surrounding me, suffocating the very space I was in. I looked around, panic rising in my chest again, but there was nothing. No one. Just the shadow, stretching out like a vast, unreachable void, consuming the space. I turned back toward the street lamp, the one thing that still felt real, still anchored me in what was familiar. But even that small circle of light, seemed to flicker, its warmth now distant. The shadow was moving, swelling around it, like the dark hands of a monster pulling at its very foundation. It's happening again, I thought. The pictures. The future. The photos I'd seen, the terrible, horrible scenes, they had all been leading up to this moment. It wasn't just about the shadow anymore. It was about something much worse, something far beyond what I could comprehend. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Was it the shadow again? Was it back to finish what it had started? I spun around, my heart racing, my hands trembling, but nothing. The air was still. Then I heard it, a low, guttural laugh. It came from nowhere and everywhere all at once, echoing through my skull. You didn't listen, the voice whispered, the words reverberating inside my head. You never do. The laugh died away into silence, and for a moment, everything was still again. But I knew it wasn't over. The shadow hadn't finished with me. It was only just beginning. I felt a strange sensation, a coldness creeping up from the ground, a creeping ice that seemed to spread through my veins. The pavement cracked beneath my feet, crumbling away like it was made of dust. I looked down, horrified, but I couldn't move. The earth itself was rejecting me. I reached out, desperate to grab onto something, anything, but my hands passed through the air as though I were nothing more than a ghost. And then, I understood. I wasn't alive anymore. The shadow had taken everything from me, my life, my world, my very existence. I had fallen into it, become part of it. The photos hadn't just been a glimpse into the future. They had been a warning I'd ignored. Now, I was nothing but a part of its dark design. A shadow, trapped in the same endless night, forever. There was no escape. And I wasn't alone. From the corners of my vision, figures began to emerge, shadows of people, their eyes glowing like the ones I had seen before, their faces twisted in agony, in fear. They were trapped like I was. Prisoners of the darkness, prisoners of their own fate. All of us, forever lost in the same eternal nightmare. The last thing I heard before the world dissolved completely was that same voice, a whisper that sent a shiver through my soul. You should have listened. And then, nothing. There was no more light, no more sound. Only the cold, endless dark. It started on an ordinary Tuesday night. I had just finished my work, and the familiar silence of my apartment wrapped around me like a comforting blanket. The city outside hummed, distant and muffled, and all I wanted was to relax, to forget about everything for a few hours. But as soon as I sat down on my couch, something unusual caught my attention. It was a sound, faint at first, like a soft rustling, almost as if the walls were breathing. It didn't alarm me at first, just the usual noises of an old building settling. But as the night wore on, the sound grew. It was coming from the ventilation system. At first, I thought it was the wind. Perhaps there was a draft, some shift in the air. But when I listened closely, I could hear it more clearly, a faint, whispered murmur. At first, it was hard to make out the words. They were just fragments, like snippets of a conversation too distant to understand. I brushed it off. It had been a long day, and my mind was probably just playing tricks on me. Still, the whispering didn't stop. It persisted, like a low hum that refused to go away. Curious, I stood up and walked to the vent in the corner of my living room. I crouched down beside it, my ear nearly touching the cold metal. The voices were clearer now, though still indistinct. They seemed to be talking about me. Did she really think she could hide it? One voice asked, sharp and tinged with mockery. She's not as clever as she thinks, another responded, low and cold. I froze. A chill crept down my spine. What was this? How could anyone know what I was thinking, what I was doing, unless they were right here with me? But there was no one in my apartment. I was alone. The voices continued, now more insistent, as though they were aware of my presence, aware that I could hear them. I stood up, heart racing, and backed away from the vent. What was happening? I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just an echo from somewhere outside. Maybe it was just the building's old pipes acting up. But something about the voices felt deliberate. It was like they were speaking directly to me, about me, in a way that felt deeply unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, hoping that whatever this was, whatever these voices were, would stop. But they didn't. The murmuring grew louder, more insistent. They spoke of things only I would know. Things I hadn't even thought about for years. They whispered about my childhood, my past mistakes, the dark corners of my mind I tried to forget. And then, there was something new. A harsh, sharp voice broke through the whispers, loud and demanding. She's not ready. We need to push her further. The air around me seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides, as if the very walls were closing in. My heart pounded in my chest. I shot up from the bed, panic flooding my veins. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone anymore. I rushed to the living room, desperate to find some logical explanation for the voices. But as I stood there, staring at the vent, the sound faded. The apartment was still, eerily quiet again. The voices were gone, as though they had never been there at all. I wanted to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I had heard things out of fatigue, or that it was simply the building creaking and groaning. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something was in my apartment, and it was watching me. The next few nights were the same. I would lie in bed, trying to sleep, and the voices would return. Each night, they grew bolder, more aggressive. They began to mock me openly, discussing my fears, my insecurities, even the things I had never told a soul. They knew everything. The worst part? They weren't just whispers anymore. They were louder now, more demanding. "Why don't you listen?" one voice hissed, a voice so close it felt as though it was right behind me. "You'll never escape us," another warned, its tone icy and final. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out, to escape whatever this was. But where could I go? The apartment, the walls, the very air around me, all felt tainted by those voices. The shadows in my home felt darker, thicker. And every time I tried to leave, every time I tried to forget, the voices would follow. I was trapped. But the voices weren't just following me, they were getting closer. They were becoming more precise, more pointed, as though they were closing in on me, narrowing their focus to something specific. To me. I knew that I couldn't ignore this anymore. Something, or someone, was lurking in the walls, and I had to face it, or it would drive me mad. The morning after the first night of hearing the voices, I felt exhausted. I hadn't slept a wink, and the weight of fear hung over me like a thick fog. But I told myself it was just stress, a result of too much work, too much isolation. After all, it wasn't the first time I'd felt paranoid. Still, the unease lingered. I went about my day, trying to act normal, but it was as if every shadow in the apartment was watching me. The quiet hum of the city outside felt louder, more oppressive, as if everything around me was alive, waiting. That night, I didn't wait for the voices to begin on their own. I sat in front of the vent, watching it closely. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, maybe nothing, maybe the reassurance that I was just imagining it all. But as soon as the clock struck midnight, the whispers returned. At first, they were faint, like a distant conversation in another room. But they quickly grew stronger, and I could make out the words with disturbing clarity. "She's here, ready," a voice muttered, low and sinister. Then another, as if picking up where the first left off, "She won't stop. She can't. She'll never escape." I felt the blood drain from my face. My instinct screamed at me to run, to leave, to get away from whatever this was. But my feet remained frozen to the floor. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered into the empty room, my voice shaky. "Who are you?" The vent remained silent for a long moment. Then, as if to answer my question, a voice hissed back, closer than before, almost as if it was in the same room with me. "We are your past. Your mistakes. We know everything." It was as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me. My heart raced in my chest, and for a moment, I felt dizzy. I scrambled back from the vent, stumbling toward the door. But no matter how fast I moved, I could still hear them, those voices, just behind me, never far enough. I rushed out into the hallway, desperate to escape. But when I reached the stairs, something stopped me. The building was unnervingly still. No footsteps, no creaks from above or below. And then I heard something new. The voices weren't just in the vents anymore. They were in the air, swirling around me. They were coming from everywhere, inside my head, inside my bones, inside the very walls themselves. "Do you think you can run from us?" one voice mocked, so close that it made my skin crawl. "You can't hide," another hissed, a sharp edge to its tone. I turned in every direction, my eyes darting about, but there was no one there. Nothing but empty hallways and shadows. Yet the voices continued, suffocating me with their presence. I backed up against the wall, panic clawing at my throat. I thought of my phone, but the idea of calling for help seemed ridiculous. Who would believe me? How could I explain this? The only sound I could hear was the relentless murmuring, growing louder, more urgent. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the silence fell. The voices stopped. The air grew still. I stood there, trembling, not daring to move, listening for the next whisper, the next taunting comment. But nothing came. I felt like I was being tested, like some unseen force was watching me, waiting to see what I would do next. My head spun with confusion. Was this real? Was I losing my mind? I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. Every night was the same. Every night, they grew more invasive, more malicious. They knew everything about me, every mistake, every secret, every doubt I had ever hidden away. One night, after hours of being tormented by their voices, I finally decided to confront whatever this was. I couldn't live like this anymore. The shadows in my apartment weren't just shadows. The voices weren't just whispers. Something was behind it all, something far worse than my imagination could comprehend. I turned off all the lights, leaving only the dim glow from the street outside. I sat in front of the vent again, this time resolute. "Show yourself," I whispered into the darkened room, my voice trembling with defiance. "I'm not afraid anymore." For a long time, there was no response. The apartment seemed to hold its breath. But then, slowly, the temperature in the room began to drop. The hairs on my neck stood on end as I heard something move behind me, something scraping against the floor. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, except for the shadows. They were deeper now, stretching across the room in unnatural shapes. The shadows twisted, forming something that almost resembled a figure. I could hear them, the voices, closer than ever, louder now, like a chorus rising in the dark. "You asked for us," one voice growled. "No escape," another whispered, cold and sharp. I backed away, but the shadows moved with me. They followed every step I took, growing darker, creeping closer. I could feel the presence of something not human. And for the first time, I understood. I wasn't just hearing voices. I wasn't just seeing shadows. They were in my mind, in my soul, and they weren't going to let me go. They were part of me now, and I could feel them, breathing with me. The next day was a blur. I didn't leave the apartment. I couldn't bring myself to go outside, to face the world where nothing felt real anymore. I couldn't stop thinking about the shadows, the voices. They had become a part of me, a constant presence, whispering in the quiet spaces of my mind. Even in the daylight, I could feel their cold touch, lurking just beyond my thoughts. I tried to tell myself that it was all in my head, that I was just imagining things. But every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear them, feel them. The voices echoed in my ears, now blending with the noises of the city outside, footsteps, car engines, distant conversations, but underneath it all, there was that underlying hum of whispers. Always watching. Always waiting. That night, I sat in front of the vent once more. This time, I had no illusions. The voices were real. They weren't just figments of my imagination, and they weren't going to stop. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. They know, I whispered, my voice trembling as I spoke to the empty room. They know everything. And that's when it happened. The vent, which had been silent for hours, suddenly rattled. I jumped back in surprise, my heart racing. The voices returned, but this time they weren't soft whispers. They were loud, distorted, as if 100 different voices were speaking all at once. You can't escape, they screamed, overlapping each other. You belong to us now. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 people shouting in my ears, all at once. I pressed my hands to my head, trying to block out the noise, but it only got worse. I felt like I was being torn apart from the inside. Stop! I shouted, my voice hoarse. Please, just leave me alone. The voices didn't stop. Instead, they became more urgent, more insistent. We're your past, one voice hissed, its words slow and deliberate. You can't outrun what you've done. The room began to spin. I clutched the edge of the table, trying to steady myself, but everything felt wrong. The shadows were thicker now, creeping along the walls like something alive, stretching and distorting into shapes I couldn't understand. They seemed to be closing in on me, pushing me into a corner. Then, through the cacophony of voices, I heard something that froze my blood. Tonight you will see, one of the voices murmured, almost lovingly. Tonight, you will understand. I turned towards the vent, my body trembling with fear. What did they mean by that? What would I understand? The air grew colder, and I could see my breath forming little clouds in front of my face. My pulse quickened as I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. But no one was there. I moved towards the door, wanting to leave, to run away, but the moment I touched the handle, the room went completely silent. Everything stopped. The shadows that had been creeping around the room seemed to freeze, caught in mid-motion. The voices were gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. I stood there, heart racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, just beneath the flickering light of the lamp, a dark figure began to emerge. At first, it was just a silhouette, a vague shape, but as it stepped into the light, it became clearer. It was tall, too tall, and the air around it seemed to distort, like it was bending reality itself. The figure didn't speak. It just stood there, staring at me with eyes that glowed faintly, like coals burning in the dark. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed, unable to move or look away. The figure took a slow step towards me, and the moment it did, I felt something shift within me. The voices in my head, the whispers that had been tormenting me, all of a sudden fell silent. The figure's gaze was all-consuming, like it was pulling something out of me, something I couldn't even begin to understand. You wanted to know, the figure's voice boomed, deep and echoing through my mind. Now you will see. Without warning, the air seemed to rip apart. Reality itself felt like it was bending, breaking, and I could hear the faintest sound of something shuffling, something moving, no, crawling from the shadows. But it was too late to react. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the figure's hand reaching out toward me, the fingers stretching impossibly long. And then, nothing. When I awoke, I was back in my bed. But nothing felt right. The silence in the apartment was suffocating, oppressive. It was as if everything had changed while I was unconscious. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move on their own, flickering and shifting as if alive. I sat up, my head spinning. What had happened? Had it all been a dream? No, I knew it hadn't been. The fear was still there, still crawling under my skin. The shadows were closer now, and the voices were silent, but I could feel them, waiting. And I knew that whatever had visited me that night wasn't finished. It was still watching, still waiting, and it wasn't going to stop until it had me. The worst part? I wasn't sure if I was the one being hunted, or if I had become the hunter. The next few days passed in a haze, a blur of confusion and fear. I could no longer tell if I was awake or trapped in a nightmare. Everything felt wrong, distorted, like the world around me had been altered, but in a way I couldn't explain. My apartment, once a safe space, now felt like a cage. Every shadow seemed to whisper my name. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind felt like a warning. I tried to go to work, to return to normalcy, but the moment I stepped outside, something inside me snapped. The streetlights flickered as I walked past, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. I could feel the weight of invisible eyes on me. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something, anything, lurking in the corners of my vision. But when I turned, there was nothing. Just the same empty street. By the time I got home that evening, I could barely stand the thought of being alone in my apartment. But I had no choice. There was no escape. I had to face it, whatever it was. The shadows in the apartment had grown bolder. They stretched across the walls like living things, twisting and writhing as if they had a life of their own. The air was thick with a strange heaviness, like something was pressing on me from all sides. And the voices, they were still there, though they had grown quieter, almost silent. I couldn't hear their words anymore, but I knew they were watching, listening, waiting for me to make my next move. I sat in the living room, staring at the vent, dreading the inevitable. I couldn't escape the sounds, the eyes, the presence that seemed to be growing stronger with every passing moment. My thoughts were fragmented, lost in a haze of fear and confusion. I didn't know what was real anymore. Was it the shadows that moved on their own, or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? The silence stretched on, unnervingly thick. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, the vent rattled again. This time, it was different. The sound wasn't just a random clatter, it felt deliberate, purposeful. A slow, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against the metal. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. My breath caught in my throat as I waited, every muscle in my body tense with anticipation. The air around me grew colder, and I knew, deep down, that whatever had been haunting me was close, too close. Then, the whispering began again. But this time, it wasn't just voices. It was laughter. A soft, mocking laugh, like the sound of a child playing a cruel game. The laughter echoed in the vents, reverberating off the walls, filling the room with a bone-chilling sense of dread. My eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing. Just shadows, shifting and flickering like firelight. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as though something was holding me in place, keeping me rooted to the spot. The laughter grew louder, more distorted, and then, in the midst of it, I heard a voice. One I recognized. "You can't escape." It was my voice. But it wasn't me speaking. The voice was distorted, twisted, like it had been stretched and contorted beyond recognition. My heart hammered in my chest as the room seemed to close in around me. The shadows on the walls moved faster now, swarming like an angry swarm of insects. I could feel their weight pressing down on me, and the air grew so thick that I could barely breathe. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please, just leave me alone." The laughter stopped, and the silence that followed was suffocating. But it wasn't peaceful. It was a silence that held a promise of something far worse to come. And then, I saw it. In the corner of the room, just behind the chair where I had been sitting, a shadow began to take form. It was vague at first, just a dark outline in the dim light, but slowly it solidified. A figure, tall and thin, with limbs that stretched unnaturally long. The edges of its body seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like it was made of pure darkness, a shape that could barely hold its form. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it was savoring every moment. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence alone filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. "Do you understand now?" The figure's voice was like the sound of wind through dead leaves, cold and hollow. It wasn't a voice I could place. It didn't sound human, not entirely. But it was familiar, somehow. It was the voice of everything I had been running from. The figure moved closer, and I could feel my body trembling with fear. It was like standing in the presence of something ancient, something that didn't belong to this world. Something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment. "You are the key," it whispered. "The one who will unlock the truth. The one who will set us free." I didn't understand. I couldn't understand. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, disappearing into the shadows from which it had emerged. I was alone again. But the silence was no comfort. The room felt different now. The shadows had grown deeper, more menacing. The vent, once just a harmless part of the apartment, now seemed like a doorway to another world, one I wasn't sure I wanted to enter. I backed away, my eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of the figure. But there was nothing. Only the oppressive darkness, the sense of being trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end. I had to get out. I had to leave before it came back. But as I reached for the door, I heard the faintest sound, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. It was coming from the vent. A voice. A familiar voice. My voice. And this time, the voice wasn't alone. "We are waiting for you." I froze in the doorway, my hand still gripping the doorknob. My body was paralyzed with fear. The voice, my own voice, echoed in the room, but it wasn't me speaking. It was something else. Something that wasn't supposed to be in this world. "We are waiting for you." The words hung in the air, like they were being whispered directly into my mind. The tone was cold, empty, like a warning, but also a promise. I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, to twist and bend in ways that defied reason. I could feel them pulling at me, like invisible hands reaching out to drag me back into the dark. My hands shook as I backed away from the door, retreating toward the far corner of the room. My feet stumbled over the floor, and I had to force myself not to scream. I wouldn't let myself be consumed by this. I had to find a way out. There had to be a way out. But the walls seemed to close in around me. The vent rattled again, louder this time, as if something was pushing against it from the inside, trying to break through. I could hear the sounds of shuffling footsteps, as if someone, was moving within the ventilation system. The laughter came next. It was softer at first, but then it grew louder, more distinct. It was as if the laughter was coming from all directions, filling the apartment, bouncing off the walls, echoing in my skull. And then, as if on cue, the lights flickered and went out. The apartment was plunged into darkness, the only sound now the thumping of my heart in my ears. My breaths came faster, more shallow, and I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my back. I could no longer see the shadows, but I could feel them, their presence all around me. They were here. They were inside. I wanted to run. I had to escape. But as I turned toward the door again, I saw something in the corner of my eye. A figure, barely visible in the dark, standing by the window. It was tall and thin, its form just barely perceptible in the dim light from the street below. It was the same figure from before. The one from the shadows. The one who had spoken to me. But now, it was different. Its limbs had grown even longer, more twisted, and its face, if you could even call it a face, was a mass of shifting darkness, like it was made of the very night itself. It took a step forward. I gasped, stumbling backward. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was frozen, trapped in the grip of something I couldn't understand, couldn't control. And then, through the silence, I heard it again. The voice. But this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus. 1,000 voices, all speaking in unison. You cannot escape. It was everywhere. In my head, in the walls, in the very air I breathed. The voices wrapped around me like chains, holding me in place, suffocating me with their cold, empty tone. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The world was collapsing around me, and I was at the center of it, trapped in a nightmare that was unfolding in real time. And then, a thought, a desperate, frantic thought, pushed its way to the surface of my mind. The vent. The voices were coming from the vent. It was the only way in, the only way out. Without thinking, I ran toward the hallway where the vent was. It was small, too small for anyone to fit through, but maybe, just maybe, I could stop it. I had to try. I had no other choice. As I reached the vent, I tore at the grill with trembling hands, pulling it off the wall. My heart raced as I peered into the dark hole beyond, the feeling of something watching me, waiting, growing stronger with every passing second. And then, I heard it. A breath. Not my own, but something else, something cold and wet. It came from deep within the vent. I backed away, stumbling in my panic. The darkness seemed to close in around me, swallowing up the light. The figure was behind me again, its cold presence a shadow I couldn't outrun. You are the key, it whispered, its voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through my bones. And now, we will set you free. I turned to face it, but there was no escape. There was only the darkness. The shadows. The voices. And then, the world went silent. For one brief, terrifying moment, everything stopped. The air, once thick with the sound of whispers and laughter, fell completely still. I couldn't hear my own breath. I couldn't feel anything at all. And then, with a sound like the crack of thunder, the vent exploded open. Something rushed out, something dark and formless, and it was coming straight for me. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. It was over. The next morning, when the landlord came by to check on me, the apartment was empty. The door was wide open, the lights still flickering, but there was no sign of me. The neighbors heard nothing. They saw nothing. Except, of course, for the strange shadow that lingered beneath the streetlight just outside the building, stretching across the pavement like it had always been there. waiting. I have to ask you, have you ever found something that you didn't remember losing? Something that seemed entirely out of place, as if it didn't belong in your life? That's exactly what happened to me. One evening, I was going through my coat pockets, something I hadn't done in weeks, when I felt something cool and metallic tucked into the deep corner of the fabric. At first, I thought it was just an old coin or a piece of forgotten change, but when I pulled it out, I realized it was a key. I had no idea where it had come from. No memory of placing it there. It was an antique-looking thing with intricate engravings I couldn't decipher. The metal was slightly tarnished, but still sturdy, and it had the feel of something that had seen years, maybe even centuries of use. It didn't look like any ordinary key. It felt important, as though it was meant for something special. I held it in my hand for a moment, turning it over, studying it. And then I did what I probably shouldn't have done. I decided to keep it. Something about it felt wrong, but at the same time, it felt like a missing piece of something that had been waiting to be found. That night, as I was going about my usual evening routine, I noticed something odd. The apartment was the same as always, dimly lit, quiet, and still, but then I saw it. A door. A door that I swear wasn't there before. It stood at the far end of the hallway, right next to the bathroom, where there had never been a door. It was made of dark wood, the grain swirling in a pattern I couldn't place. There was no doorknob, no lock, just a smooth surface. My first instinct was to ignore it, to chalk it up to a trick of my mind. Maybe I was tired. But when I reached out to touch the surface of the door, I was stunned to find that it was real, solid, and cold to the touch. I hesitated. Then, without thinking, I reached into my pocket and took out the key. It slid easily into the keyhole I hadn't even noticed before, turning smoothly, as though the door was waiting for me to open it. It creaked as it swung open, and I was greeted by nothing. Just empty space. The room on the other side was dark, almost pitch black, and for a moment I thought I had made a mistake. But something pulled me forward. I stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a force that made the walls shake. I turned to find myself standing in a narrow hallway that was not part of my apartment. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, and the air was thick, musty, as if no one had walked these halls in years. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dark and foreboding. I tried to step back, but the door was gone. It was as if it had never been there. I was trapped, alone in this strange new space, with no idea how I had gotten here or what I was supposed to do next. The only thing I could hear was the faint sound of my own breathing, but then there was something else. A soft creak. A distant sound, like footsteps echoing from the far end of the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I froze in place, listening, but the sound didn't repeat. I was alone, or so I thought. I turned to explore, my feet heavy on the old wood floor. As I walked deeper into the darkness, the air seemed to grow thicker, the shadows pressing in on me. The walls closed in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then, out of nowhere, another door appeared. It wasn't there a second ago, and yet there it was, plain and unassuming, but the moment I laid eyes on it, a cold shiver ran down my spine. It stood just ahead, waiting for me. I didn't know what to do. Something in me screamed to turn back, to find a way out of this nightmare, but I couldn't stop myself. My hand reached for the pocket, and there, in the very same place as before, was the key. The strange, old key. It slid into the lock with a soft click. I opened the door. What I found on the other side wasn't just a room, it was a reflection of my apartment. But it wasn't quite right. The furniture was out of place, the colors too harsh, the shadows too deep. I could feel the weight of something unseen watching me, and I knew that I had stepped into a different version of my own home. But that wasn't the worst part. I heard something. A voice, soft at first, then louder and more distinct, as if calling me. "Come closer. We're waiting for you." The words echoed in my mind, growing louder with each passing second. My skin prickled, and my breath quickened. There was a presence in that room, something malevolent, something that didn't belong. I backed away, and the door slammed shut, as if the house itself was rejecting me. Suddenly, I heard the familiar creak again, this time much closer. The sound of footsteps. But these weren't the footsteps of someone walking. They were heavy, deliberate, as though someone, or something, was pacing just beyond the walls of the room. I felt my chest tighten, my throat dry, and I reached into my pocket again. The key was still there, cold and waiting. With trembling hands, I unlocked another door. The moment I opened the next door, the air grew colder, a biting chill that seemed to come from the very core of the space. It was as if the door had opened into another world entirely, one that was frozen in time and filled with a sense of deep, unsettling emptiness. I stepped forward, hesitating just for a second. The floor beneath my feet creaked as I moved, but I couldn't tell if it was my own unease or something else making the sound. This room was different from the others. The walls were bare, and the ceiling stretched far above me, obscured by the darkness. There was no furniture, no decorations, no signs of life, just darkness. But in the very center of the room, a single object stood, an old chair. It was a high-backed, wooden thing, its dark finish gleaming slightly in the dim light. The chair was positioned as if someone had placed it there deliberately, facing the center of the room, waiting. My breath caught. I didn't want to go near it. It felt wrong, like the chair was expecting me to sit in it. But I didn't have a choice. The key was still in my hand, its cold, smooth metal pressing against my palm, urging me forward. The door behind me slammed shut. I didn't even turn to look at it. I could feel it was gone, just as it had been before. I was locked in this place now, trapped in whatever nightmare was unfolding around me. I approached the chair. Every step felt like it echoed through the space, the sound of my footsteps too loud, too deliberate. My heart raced, thumping loudly in my chest, as if warning me to leave. But I didn't. I had to know. I reached out and touched the back of the chair. The wood was smooth, but it seemed to vibrate slightly beneath my fingers, as though it was alive. A strange sense of recognition swept over me, but I couldn't place it. The air around me shifted, thickening, as if something unseen was drawing near. And then, the whispering began. At first, it was faint, barely audible, like a low murmur. But as the seconds passed, it grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from behind me, from the walls, from all around me. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel them. The voices were calling my name, beckoning me. "Come closer, it's waiting for you." I turned around, my heart in my throat, but I saw nothing. The room was still empty, the shadows deep, but nothing was there. The whispers grew more frantic, urgent, like the voices were pleading, begging me to listen, to follow. With a sense of dread gripping my chest, I glanced back at the chair. It was still there, silent, unmoving, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I could almost feel the wave of eyes on me, though I knew no one was there. Suddenly, the voices grew louder, overwhelming. It was as though the very walls themselves were speaking to me. "Sit down." I stumbled backward, my legs shaking. I couldn't understand it. The key was still in my hand, cold and heavy, urging me toward the chair. No, I couldn't. I shouldn't sit there. But the whispers kept coming. And then, almost against my will, my body moved forward. I reached for the chair, my hand shaking as I placed it on the armrest. It was as though I had no control over my own actions. The moment my fingers made contact with the wood, a jolt ran through my body like a current of electricity. I sat down. The instant I did, the room seemed to shift. The air grew colder, the darkness more suffocating. I could feel the weight of the shadows pressing down on me, and I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The whispers stopped. A silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating. I could feel something just behind me, standing so close that I could hear its breath, slow, steady, but unnaturally deep. "You shouldn't have sat down," a voice growled in my ear. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The chair, the room, the door, all were as they had been. But then, in the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure. It was a shadow at first, barely perceptible, but it grew. I could make out the outline of something, or someone, moving toward me, the shape becoming clearer with every passing second. The figure was tall, too tall. Its limbs were too long, stretching unnaturally as it slithered forward. I couldn't move. My body wouldn't respond, frozen in place, rooted to the chair. The key in my hand had gone cold, colder than before. The figure stepped into the dim light, and I could finally see it clearly. It was a man, or at least it had been once. His face was a twisted mask of hollow eyes and a gaping mouth, but it was his arms that terrified me most. They were long, impossibly long, reaching the floor in a grotesque mockery of human proportions. And the worst part? It was smiling. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" it whispered, its voice like gravel scraping against metal. "This is only the beginning." Before I could react, its hand, no, its claw, shot out, grabbing my wrist with terrifying speed. I tried to scream, but no sound came. And then, everything went black. I awoke in a cold sweat, my body trembling, every nerve on high alert. The darkness around me felt like a suffocating weight, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. For a moment, I wasn't sure where I was. My mind struggled to grasp the reality of the situation. Was I still in that room? Had it all been a dream? I quickly sat up, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of the nightmare. The air smelled stale, and the faint hum of the ventilation system filled the silence. My apartment. I was back in my own space. The room was dimly lit, the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the window. But something was off. I stood up slowly, my legs still shaky, and glanced around. My apartment looked the same. The warm couch, the kitchen in the distance, the small hallway leading to the bathroom. Everything was as it should be, or so it seemed. But my hand. The key was still in my grasp, cold and solid. I gasped, dropping it onto the floor. It was the same key, the one I had found in my coat pocket. The one that had opened those strange doors. The one that had led me into the room with the terrifying figure. I had left it behind, hadn't I? I couldn't remember. The sudden memory of the figure, its long limbs and twisted smile, rushed back. My heart pounded in my chest, and a sickening wave of dread washed over me. What did it mean? What had happened to me? I had to leave. I had to get out. I rushed to the door, fumbling with the handle. It wouldn't open. I twisted, pulled, shoved against it, but it was as if something on the other side was holding it shut. Let me out. I screamed, banging on the door, my panic rising with every failed attempt. Then I heard it. A soft, scraping sound. It was coming from the direction of the bathroom, the distinct noise of something dragging across the floor. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart skipped a beat. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to face whatever was lurking in the shadows of my apartment. But I had to. The fear was paralyzing, but it was also pushing me forward. I turned toward the sound, my legs unsteady as I crept toward the hallway. The air felt colder now, a chill that sank deep into my bones. Every step I took seemed to echo through the apartment, the silence punctuated only by the sound of my breathing. The bathroom door was slightly ajar. I could see the faint outline of something moving inside, a shadow shifting. I stood frozen, staring at the crack in the door, unsure of what to do next. The dragging sound stopped, and for a moment there was nothing. Just the quiet. But then, a whisper. Come closer. I flinched, my hands trembling. The voice was soft but unmistakable, familiar yet alien. It was the same voice that had whispered to me in that other room. The one that had commanded me to sit in the chair. I could feel it crawling under my skin, burrowing into my mind. Closer. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let whatever this was get to me. But the door. I had to open it. Someone, was waiting for me behind it. The key, still lying on the floor, glinted in the dim light. It was as if it was calling me, reminding me that I was trapped, that I had no choice but to keep going. I bent down and picked it up, my fingers numb against the cold metal. It felt heavier now, almost like it was pulling me toward the bathroom, pulling me toward the unknown. With shaking hands, I reached for the door. It creaked as I pushed it open, the darkness inside swallowing the light. I stepped in. The bathroom was empty, or so it seemed. The tiles were cracked, the mirror fogged up with condensation. But there was something wrong. The air was thick, charged with a strange energy. The sink was running, but the water was dark, almost black, swirling in a way that didn't look natural. The light above flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the room. And then I saw it. The reflection in the mirror wasn't mine. It was a face. Twisted, pale, and deformed, with eyes that were wide and unblinking, staring back at me. The mouth was open in a silent scream, the lips cracked and torn. The figure moved, its lips curling into a smile that sent a chill down my spine. I turned around quickly, but the bathroom was still empty. I was alone. But the figure in the mirror wasn't gone. It was still there, its eyes locked onto mine. It whispered something I couldn't hear, its mouth moving without sound. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I reached for the door to leave, but before I could, the lights went out. Complete darkness. Then, a soft laugh echoed through the room, not from the mirror, but from somewhere deeper within the apartment, somewhere I couldn't see. The key. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I was no longer in control. The door, the key, the figure in the mirror, they were all part of this twisted game. And I wasn't going to escape. The laugh grew louder. I backed away from the mirror, my hands trembling. The sound of footsteps began to echo behind me, slow, deliberate, like something was approaching from the shadows. I ran. I ran blindly, my feet slapping against the floor as I dashed down the narrow hallway. Every step felt like it was sinking me deeper into the nightmare. My breath came in ragged gasps, but the sound of footsteps, those slow, deliberate steps, kept pace with me. They were behind me, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. The apartment seemed to stretch out endlessly, the walls closing in. Each turn I made only led me deeper into the maze of rooms that never should have existed. The doors, each one more ominous than the last, were everywhere. But the key was still in my hand, and it was cold, colder than before, as though it were pulling me towards something. I slammed my shoulder into a door and it burst open. I didn't even bother to look back at the hallway. I stepped inside the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was small, an old study, filled with dusty bookshelves, a rickety desk, and a chair that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I turned quickly to shut the door behind me, but as soon as my fingers touched the handle, I froze. The sound of the footsteps was gone. There was nothing but the soft hum of the air conditioning and my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. Was it over? I whispered to myself. Had I finally outrun it? But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. I knew it wasn't that simple. The key, in my palm, seemed to pulse as though it were alive, as though it had a purpose, a call to which I was bound. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel it, the weight of inevitability. The hum of the ventilation system was louder now, and I could hear it, the faint rustling of something moving within the walls. Something watching, waiting. I turned slowly toward the desk. On the surface, there were papers, old, yellowed with age. A piece of chalk lay on top of a dusty blackboard that was mounted on the far wall. Something caught my eye beneath the desk, a small metal object. A drawer, slightly ajar. I felt an odd compulsion to open it. My fingers brushed against the cool metal as I slid the drawer open. Inside, there was a stack of old papers, a few photographs, and something that made my stomach drop, another key, identical to the one I had found. It was the same, and it was waiting for me. I swallowed hard, but before I could stop myself, I reached for the key, my hand trembling. As soon as I touched it, a sharp, cold sensation shot up my arm, and I jerked back with a gasp. The air around me shifted. I couldn't explain it, but the entire room felt different. The air felt thicker, the walls more oppressive. The sound of the ventilation became a loud roar, as if something was moving through the ducts at an alarming speed. My mind raced. What was happening? Why did I have this key? Why did I feel like I was being dragged deeper into this? I glanced back at the door, but something stopped me from moving. The key. It seemed to pulse in my hand, urging me towards something, toward a door I hadn't seen before. It was as if I didn't have a choice. I turned and stepped forward, my legs feeling like they were moving of their own accord. The door, this one, standing at the far end of the room, wasn't there when I had entered. It hadn't existed until now. But there it was, standing tall, its dark wood gleaming in the dim light. The key fit perfectly into the lock, the sound of the mechanism clicking into place sending a shockwave of dread through me. I opened the door. It was pitch black beyond the threshold. No light, no sound, nothing. Just emptiness, as though the room beyond existed in a different dimension. I stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, and the air became suffocating, as if I had walked into a vacuum. The darkness was absolute, but I could feel the presence of something, or someone, standing just out of reach. A whisper reached my ears, the same voice, soft but unmistakable. "You're mine now." I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the crushing dark. The temperature dropped, and a low hum began to emanate from the floor, vibrating through the soles of my shoes. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen in place, my mind racing but unable to form a coherent thought. The key in my hand grew colder, its metal growing heavier with each passing second. The darkness around me seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. And then I heard it. A sound. A scraping. Something dragging across the floor. It was coming closer. I could feel it. I could hear it. I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone at all. The scraping noise grew louder, closer. My breath caught in my throat, each exhale feeling like it could be my last. My hands gripped the key tighter, its cold surface cutting into my palm, but I couldn't move. I couldn't make a sound. It was as if the very air was thickening around me, pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. The darkness itself seemed to move, undulating in waves, as if it were alive. The sound of something dragging across the floor grew more distinct, like nails scraping along stone. Slowly, cautiously, I turned my head, straining to catch any hint of a shadow, a figure, anything. There was nothing. But the air had changed. The hum had turned into something more sinister, vibrating with a frequency that seemed to make the very walls of the room pulse, like it was alive, too. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, but before I could even contemplate what to do next, I heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, just a breath against the back of my neck. Then it grew louder, and with it, a distinct voice, low, guttural, yet eerily calm. "You're not meant to be here," it murmured. "You shouldn't have opened the door." I froze, paralyzed by fear, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice seemed to come from all around me, 1,000 whispers blending into one. My body was still trapped in place, unable to move, unable to react. The key in my hand felt like it was burning through my skin. A sudden sharp pain shot through my wrist. I gasped, looking down, and saw something, black tendrils, thin and sinuous, emerging from the darkness, curling around my hand, pulling at the key. I tried to pull away, but the tendrils were stronger. They twisted around my wrist, tightening with each passing second. The key was slipping from my hand, dragged by an unseen force, and I could feel the darkness pulling it away, as if it wanted the key more than anything. "Give it back," the voice hissed, now a growl. "It's not yours." It never was. The tendrils tightened further, digging into my flesh, dragging me closer to the ground. Panic surged through me, and in a frantic attempt to free myself, I dropped the key. It fell to the floor with a soft clink, and for a brief moment, everything stopped. The darkness held its breath. Then, as if the world had exhaled, everything crashed down around me. The scraping noise intensified, now accompanied by a guttural growl, a sound so deep it vibrated through my bones. The tendrils recoiled, vanishing into the shadows. I staggered back, my heart racing. My breath was shallow, ragged, as if I had run a marathon. The air was still thick, but the force holding me in place seemed to weaken. I could move. I could run. But before I could make a step, the door, the one I had come through, slammed open, revealing nothing but more darkness. My vision blurred. The room around me began to twist and warp. The walls started to close in. The shadows stretched, reaching for me like hands, desperate to pull me back in. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The door. The key. The voices. I was trapped in this nightmare with no way out. And then, in a flash of desperate clarity, I understood. I was never meant to escape. With a final, bone-chilling scream, the room collapsed around me, and the darkness consumed me whole. My mind raced. What was happening? Why did I have this key? Why did I feel like I was being dragged deeper into this? I glanced back at the door, but something stopped me from moving. The key. It seemed to pulse in my hand, urging me towards something, toward a door I hadn't seen before. It was as if I didn't have a choice. I turned and stepped forward, my legs feeling like they were moving of their own accord. The door, this one, standing at the far end of the room, wasn't there when I had entered. It hadn't existed until now. But there it was, standing tall, its dark wood gleaming in the dim light. The key fit perfectly into the lock, the sound of the mechanism clicking into place sending a shockwave of dread through me. I opened the door. It was pitch black beyond the threshold. No light, no sound, nothing. Just emptiness, as though the room beyond existed in a different dimension. I stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, and the air became suffocating, as if I had walked into a vacuum. The darkness was absolute, but I could feel the presence of something, or someone, standing just out of reach. A whisper reached my ears, the same voice, soft but unmistakable. "You're mine now." I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the crushing dark. The temperature dropped, and a low hum began to emanate from the floor, vibrating through the soles of my shoes. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen in place, my mind racing but unable to form a coherent thought. The key in my hand grew colder, its metal growing heavier with each passing second. The darkness around me seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. And then I heard it. A sound. A scraping. Something dragging across the floor. It was coming closer. I could feel it. I could hear it. I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone at all. The scraping noise grew louder, closer. My breath caught in my throat, each exhale feeling like it could be my last. My hands gripped the key tighter, its cold surface cutting into my palm, but I couldn't move. I couldn't make a sound. It was as if the very air was thickening around me, pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. The darkness itself seemed to move, undulating in waves, as if it were alive. The sound of something dragging across the floor grew more distinct, like nails scraping along stone. Slowly, cautiously, I turned my head, straining to catch any hint of a shadow, a figure, anything. There was nothing. But the air had changed. The hum had turned into something more sinister, vibrating with a frequency that seemed to make the very walls of the room pulse, like it was alive, too. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, but before I could even contemplate what to do next, I heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, just a breath against the back of my neck. Then it grew louder, and with it, a distinct voice, low, guttural, yet eerily calm. "You're not meant to be here," it murmured. "You shouldn't have opened the door." I froze, paralyzed by fear, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice seemed to come from all around me, 1,000 whispers blending into one. My body was still trapped in place, unable to move, unable to react. The key in my hand felt like it was burning through my skin. A sudden sharp pain shot through my wrist. I gasped, looking down, and saw something, black tendrils, thin and sinuous, emerging from the darkness, curling around my hand, pulling at the key. I tried to pull away, but the tendrils were stronger. They twisted around my wrist, tightening with each passing second. The key was slipping from my hand, dragged by an unseen force, and I could feel the darkness pulling it away, as if it wanted the key more than anything. "Give it back," the voice hissed, now a growl. "It's not yours." It never was. The tendrils tightened further, digging into my flesh, dragging me closer to the ground. Panic surged through me, and in a frantic attempt to free myself, I dropped the key. It fell to the floor with a soft clink, and for a brief moment, everything stopped. The darkness held its breath. Then, as if the world had exhaled, everything crashed down around me. The scraping noise intensified, now accompanied by a guttural growl, a sound so deep it vibrated through my bones. The tendrils recoiled, vanishing into the shadows. I staggered back, my heart racing. My breath was shallow, ragged, as if I had run a marathon. The air was still thick, but the force holding me in place seemed to weaken. I could move. I could run. But before I could make a step, the door, the one I had come through, slammed open, revealing nothing but more darkness. My vision blurred. The room around me began to twist and warp. The walls started to close in. The shadows stretched, reaching for me like hands, desperate to pull me back in. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The door. The key. The voices. I was trapped in this nightmare with no way out. And then, in a flash of desperate clarity, I understood. I was never meant to escape. With a final, bone-chilling scream, the room collapsed around me, and the darkness consumed me whole. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.